The rivers of Eastern Europe flow like arteries through a vast continent, carrying secrets in their dark waters. Down the Volkhov, through the rapids of the Dnieper, across the portages that connect the Baltic to the Black Sea. For centuries, these waterways witnessed an extraordinary transformation. Scandinavian warriors, traders, and adventurers who called themselves Varangians followed these liquid highways into lands no Northman had ever seen. They carried Nordic steel and amber south toward the golden city of Constantinople. They returned with Byzantine silk and Islamic silver. But somewhere in that journey between worlds they became something entirely different. In the forests of Novgorod, a Swedish warrior's son learns to speak Slavic. In the throne rooms of Constantinople, a Norwegian guardsman kneels before a Greek emperor. In the burial mounds near Kiev, a Danish trader's daughter is laid to rest with Orthodox Christian rites. These moments of transformation, multiplied across centuries, created the political and cultural foundation of Eastern Europe itself. The Varangians did not simply conquer. They adapted, intermarried, converted, and ruled. They turned Slavic villages into thriving cities. They forged trade networks that stretched from Greenland's ice to Baghdad's markets. They became the military backbone of the Byzantine Empire during its most desperate centuries. Their political innovations created the first unified Russian state. Their religious conversions brought Orthodox Christianity to millions of Slavic souls. Yet they paid a price for this success. Each generation spoke less Norse and more Slavic. Each decade saw fewer ships arriving from Scandinavia. By the 13th century, the last purely Scandinavian Varangians were dying in foreign lands, their grandsons bearing Slavic names and worshipping in Orthodox churches. This complete transformation of an entire people, their rise and ultimate absorption into the civilizations they helped create, reveals the true cost and reward of empire. The story begins in the granite fjords and pine forests of Scandinavia, where winter nights stretch longer than human memory, and summer days refuse to surrender to darkness. Here, in this land of ice and stone, a unique civilization took shape during the centuries that would witness the birth of medieval Europe. The North Sea crashes against rocky coasts with relentless fury, while inland, countless lakes mirror skies that shift from silver to steel to deepest black. This was the forge that hammered the Varangian spirit into existence. The climate itself was a harsh teacher. During the 8th and 9th centuries, Scandinavia experienced what climatologists now call the medieval warm period. Yet even this relative warmth could not transform the fundamental challenge of northern existence. Spring arrived late and departed early. Growing seasons measured in months, not the generous half-years enjoyed by southern lands. Every harvest was a gamble against frost that could arrive without warning, turning green fields into blackened waste overnight. The sea, perpetually cold even in high summer, demanded respect from any who dared venture upon its waters. In this unforgiving environment, survival required more than individual strength. It demanded community, innovation, and an almost religious devotion to craftsmanship. The long winter nights became workshops where fathers passed sacred knowledge to sons. How to read the subtle signs that distinguished seasoned oak from timber that would split in a storm. Which iron could be hammered into blades that would hold their edge through countless battles. How to navigate by stars that wheeled overhead in patterns known only to those born under northern skies. The population of Scandinavia during this period faced pressures that would have broken less adaptable societies. Archaeological evidence suggests that the relatively warmer climate led to increased agricultural productivity, which in turn supported larger populations. Yet this growth created its own problems. The limited arable land could not expand to match growing families. Inheritance customs that favoured eldest sons left younger brothers with difficult choices. They could remain as dependents on family farms, accepting diminished status and uncertain futures, or they could seek their fortunes elsewhere. This demographic pressure coincided with revolutionary innovations in shipbuilding technology. The shallow draft vessels that would become synonymous with Viking expansion emerged from centuries of gradual refinement. Scandinavian shipwrights had learned to create vessels that could navigate both open seas and inland waterways with equal effectiveness. The clinker-built construction technique, using overlapping planks secured with iron rivets, produced hulls that flexed with the waves rather than fighting them. These ships could be beached on any shore, portaged across land between river systems, and repaired with materials available in almost any wooded territory. The development of the triangular sail represented another crucial breakthrough. Unlike the square-rigged vessels used throughout most of medieval Europe, Scandinavian ships could sail much closer to the wind. This gave them unprecedented mobility, allowing crews to choose when and where to engage with both enemies and trading partners, A Scandinavian vessel approaching a foreign shore was not at the mercy of wind and current. Its crew could retreat, maneuver, or approach as circumstances dictated. Navigation techniques evolved alongside shipbuilding innovations. Scandinavian sailors developed an almost mystical ability to find their way across trackless waters. They read the flight patterns of seabirds, the subtle changes in wave formation that indicated distant shores. The scents carried on ocean winds that could reveal the presence of land beyond the horizon. They carved their knowledge into cryptic devices known as sun compasses, mechanical aids that help determine direction even on cloudy days. Most remarkably, they learned to navigate using polarized light patterns visible in Arctic skies, a technique so sophisticated that modern scientists only recently understood its theoretical basis. Metalworking reached extraordinary heights in Scandinavian society. The famous pattern-welded swords that would become terror weapons throughout Europe began as expressions of religious devotion. Master smiths spent years creating single blades, folding and refolding steel in techniques that produced distinctive serpentine patterns along the cutting edge. These were not merely weapons but sacred objects, often given names and passed down through generations like family heirlooms. The spiritual significance of metalwork extended beyond weapons to include jewellery, household implements, and ship fittings, all crafted with attention to detail that bordered on obsession. Society itself reflected these technological and environmental pressures. At the apex stood the Jarls, warrior nobles who controlled land, ships, and the loyalty of fighting men. These were not simply aristocrats living off inherited privilege. A Jarl maintained his position through constant demonstration of wisdom in council, courage in battle, and generosity in distributing wealth to his followers. Below the Jarls were the Carls, free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of Scandinavian society. These men owned their land, bore arms, and participated in the popular assemblies known as things where community decisions were debated and resolved. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage. Yet even slavery in Scandinavian society contained possibilities for advancement unknown in many other cultures. Skilled thralls could earn money through craft production, eventually purchasing their freedom. Female thralls who bore children to free men often gained improved status. The society, while hierarchical, maintained a degree of social mobility that reflected its emphasis on personal achievement over pure birth. Religious beliefs permeated every aspect of Scandinavian existence. The complex mythology centered around the Aesir and Vanir gods provided not just entertainment during long winter nights, but practical guidance for daily life. Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom and war, embodied the intellectual and martial virtues most prized in Scandinavian culture. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, flew across the 9 worlds each day gathering information, symbolizing the value placed on knowledge and cunning alongside raw strength. Thor, with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, represented the protection of order against chaos. His battles with giants and monsters reflected the constant struggle of civilization against the hostile natural forces that surrounded every Scandinavian settlement. Frey and Freya governed fertility and prosperity, reminding the people that wealth and survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with the natural world. The goddess Frigg presided over household matters, while the Norns wove the fates of gods and men alike at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree. This religious worldview emphasized personal honor above mere survival. A warrior who died courageously in battle would be welcomed into Valhalla, where he would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the final battle between order and chaos. But honor was not achieved through death alone. It required living according to principles that balanced loyalty to kin and community with individual achievement and glory. The concept of honor provided both social cohesion and motivation for the extraordinary risks that defined Scandinavian expansion. Yet not all Vikings looked westward toward the Atlantic and beyond. As populations grew and opportunities for advancement became scarce in traditional territories, some warriors and traders began exploring the waterways that led eastward from the Baltic Sea. The rivers flowing from the Gulf of Finland offered tantalizing possibilities. Unlike the western routes, which led to lands inhabited by other Germanic peoples with similar technologies and social organization, the eastern waters promised contact with entirely different civilizations. The Neva River, flowing from Lake Ladoga to the Gulf of Finland, provided the first gateway into this eastern realm. Scandinavian exploration of this route probably began as early as the mid-8th century, initially as seasonal trading expeditions seeking furs from the forest peoples who inhabited the vast woodlands beyond the Baltic. These early expeditions discovered that the Neva connected to a network of waterways that stretched deep into the continental interior. From Lake Ladoga, The Volkhov River flowed south toward Lake Ilmen, from which travellers could reach the headwaters of the great Dnieper river system. The Dnieper, in turn, flowed through hundreds of miles of forest and steppe before emptying into the Black Sea. Enterprising Scandinavians realized that this route offered unprecedented access to the wealthy Byzantine Empire centered in Constantinople, as well as to the Islamic trading networks that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. The journey was extraordinarily dangerous. The rivers themselves presented navigational challenges that claimed many lives. The Dnieper's series of rapids, known to later chroniclers as the Deadly Gates, required careful timing and expert local knowledge to negotiate safely. During low water periods, crews had to portage their vessels and cargo around these obstacles, leaving them vulnerable to attack by hostile tribes who controlled the surrounding territory. First encounters between Scandinavians and the indigenous Slavic and Finnic peoples were complex affairs that defied simple categorization as either peaceful trade or violent conquest. Archaeological evidence suggests a pattern of gradual integration rather than sudden military dominance. Scandinavian artifacts appear in Slavic settlements during the 8th and 9th centuries, but so do Slavic and Finnic objects in Scandinavian graves. This suggests reciprocal relationships involving intermarriage, cultural exchange, and mutual adaptation. The Slavic peoples encountered by these eastern-bound Scandinavians lived in a very different world from the Germanic tribes of Western Europe. Their settlements were typically small agricultural communities scattered throughout vast forests. Political organization remained largely tribal, with authority divided among various chiefs and elders who controlled different territories and resources. This decentralized structure created both opportunities and challenges for Scandinavian expansion. Finnic peoples, including ancestors of modern Finns and Estonians, controlled much of the territory around the eastern Baltic. These forest dwellers had developed sophisticated techniques for surviving in environments that challenged even hardy Scandinavians. Their knowledge of hunting, trapping, and seasonal migration patterns proved invaluable to Scandinavian traders seeking the luxury furs that commanded high prices in southern markets. The eastern expansion differed fundamentally from contemporaneous Scandinavian activities in Western Europe. While Western Vikings often pursued strategies of raiding and quick withdrawal, Eastern expeditions required sustained relationships with local populations. The distances involved and the nature of river travel made hit-and-run tactics impractical. Success demanded cooperation with indigenous peoples who controlled key portage sites, provided essential supplies, and possessed knowledge of local conditions that no outsider could quickly acquire. This difference in approach reflected the different opportunities presented by Eastern and Western expansion. Western Europe offered wealthy monasteries and towns that could be raided for immediate profit. The eastern routes led toward the Byzantine Empire and Islamic caliphates, civilizations far more powerful and better organized than anything in contemporary Western Europe. These were not targets for simple raiding, but potential trading partners offering goods unavailable anywhere else in the known world. Byzantine Constantinople represented the ultimate Eastern destination. This city, founded as Constantine's New Rome, had inherited the wealth, knowledge, and administrative sophistication of the ancient Roman Empire. Its markets offered silk from China, spices from India, precious stones from Ceylon, and silver from the vast Islamic Empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. For Scandinavians accustomed to the simple agricultural products and limited crafts available in northern Europe, Constantinople must have seemed like a vision of paradise. The lure of Islamic silver provided additional motivation for eastern expansion. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate controlled silver mines in Central Asia that produced unprecedented quantities of high-quality silver coins. These dirhams found their way into Scandinavian hands through the complex trading networks that connected the Islamic world to the Baltic region. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian hoards suggests that Islamic silver represented the primary monetary medium for major transactions throughout the Nordic world during this period. Archaeological discoveries throughout Eastern Europe have revealed the extent and complexity of early Scandinavian expansion. The earliest Scandinavian artifacts in the region date to the 8th century and include distinctively Nordic jewellery, weapons and personal ornaments found in contexts that suggest permanent settlement rather than temporary visitation. These finds appear concentrated along the major river routes, particularly around Lake Ladoga and the upper reaches of the Dnieper system. Burial practices provide especially revealing evidence for the nature of early Scandinavian settlement. Distinctively Scandinavian grave goods, including weapons, jewellery and ship rivets, appear in burials that also contain local Slavic and Finnic artifacts. This suggests rapid cultural integration. with Scandinavian settlers adopting local customs while maintaining elements of their northern identity. Some graves contain individuals buried with both Nordic weapons and Slavic pottery, indicating cultural synthesis at the most personal level. Settlement patterns visible in archaeological remains reveal a strategic approach to territorial control. Scandinavian sites cluster around key geographic choke points, river mouths, portage sites, and locations where major waterways converge. This suggests that early Scandinavian expansion focused on controlling trade routes rather than agricultural territory. Unlike the farming communities typical of Scandinavian homelands, eastern settlements appear designed primarily to facilitate long-distance commerce. Evidence of early trade networks extends far beyond the immediate areas of Scandinavian settlement. Islamic silver coins from the 8th and 9th centuries have been found in Scandinavian graves from Sweden to Iceland, testifying to the rapid development of trade connections linking northern Europe to the Islamic world via the eastern river routes. The distribution patterns of these coins suggest systematic commercial relationships, rather than random acquisition through raiding. Recent DNA studies have provided unprecedented insights into the demographic aspects of Scandinavian expansion. Analysis of modern Eastern European populations reveals clear genetic signatures of Scandinavian ancestry, but the patterns are complex and regionally variable. Some areas show evidence of substantial Scandinavian settlement, while others suggest limited elite migration, with little impact on the general population. These patterns correspond roughly to the archaeological evidence, with the strongest Scandinavian genetic signatures appearing in regions along the major river trade routes. The genetic evidence also reveals the extent to which Scandinavian expansion involved women as well as men. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, which traces maternal lineages, shows clear Scandinavian signatures in Eastern European populations. This indicates that Scandinavian women participated in the Eastern expansion, either as settlers in their own right or as wives accompanying male migrants. The presence of women suggests intentions of permanent settlement rather than temporary commercial or military expeditions. Linguistic evidence provides additional confirmation of early Scandinavian presence in Eastern Europe. Slavic languages contain numerous loanwords from Old Norse, particularly terms related to trade, navigation, and political organization. The Slavic word for prince derives from an Old Norse term meaning young warrior, while trade-related vocabulary shows clear Scandinavian origins. Place names throughout the region preserve ancient Scandinavian appellations, often in forms that suggest early adoption into local languages. The picture that emerges from this multidisciplinary evidence is of a gradual but systematic Scandinavian expansion into Eastern Europe beginning in the 8th century. This expansion differed markedly from contemporaneous activities in Western Europe, involving permanent settlement, cultural integration, and the development of sustained commercial relationships with indigenous populations. The Eastern expansion would ultimately prove more historically significant than the more famous Western raids, creating political and economic structures that would define Eastern European civilization for centuries to come. As the 9th century progressed, these early Scandinavian settlements along the eastern river routes would evolve into something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a transcontinental trading empire that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, bringing Nordic warriors into direct contact with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. The foundations laid during this period of initial exploration and settlement would support the remarkable achievements of the generations that followed. The 9th century dawned with Scandinavian settlements scattered like jewels along the waterways of Eastern Europe, each one a gateway between worlds. What had begun as seasonal trading expeditions now demanded year-round presence, permanent structures, and increasingly sophisticated understanding of the vast river network that stretched across the continent. The amateur adventurers of the previous generation were giving way to professional river pilots, men who could read water like scribes read parchment, interpreting every ripple and eddy for the secrets it revealed about depth, current, and hidden obstacles. The route that medieval chroniclers would later call the way from the Varangians to the Greeks emerged not as a single planned highway, but as an interconnected web of waterways discovered through decades of trial, error, and considerable bloodshed. From the Baltic Sea, Scandinavian vessels entered the Gulf of Finland and ascended the Neva River to Lake Ladoga, that vast inland sea whose storms could rival those of the Baltic itself. Here, at the settlement that would grow into Staria Ladoga, the first major decision point confronted every expedition venturing into the continental interior. The Volkhov River flowed south from Lake Ladoga through territories controlled by Slavic tribes who had learned that cooperation with the northern traders brought more profit than resistance. Yet cooperation came at a price. Passage rights, guides, supplies and protection all required payment in silver, trade goods or military service. The Scandinavians quickly discovered that success in the Eastern Territories depended as much on diplomatic skill as on martial prowess. From the Volkhov, expeditions reached Lake Ilmen, another vast body of water that served as a hub for multiple river systems. Here stood Novgorod, destined to become one of medieval Europe's greatest commercial centres, though in the 9th century it remained a collection of wooden fortifications and trading posts scattered around the lake's marshy shores. The wealth flowing through this region was already transforming it from a subsistence economy to something resembling urban civilization. The most challenging portion of the southern route began where expeditions left the relative safety of Lake Ilmen's tributaries and committed themselves to the Dnieper river system. This massive waterway carried more water than any river the Scandinavians had previously encountered, but its size came with proportional dangers. The upper Dnieper wound through dense forests inhabited by tribes whose relationship with passing traders ranged from cooperative to actively hostile. Seasonal flooding could transform familiar landmarks beyond recognition, while drought periods revealed new obstacles that forced lengthy portages through territories where ambush was always possible. The most notorious obstacles were the Dnieper Rapids, a series of cataracts that stretched for dozens of miles through what is now southern Ukraine. Medieval chroniclers recorded their names with a mixture of fascination and dread reserved for legendary monsters. Esupi, meaning do not sleep, Ulvorsi, Island of the Rapids, Gelendri, Noise of the Rapids, Afor, Ever Fierce, Varophoros, Wave Force, Leanti, Seething, and Strakoon, Little Rapids. Each represented a unique challenge requiring specific techniques and considerable courage to overcome. During high water periods in late spring, some rapids could be navigated by skilled crews willing to risk their vessels and lives on violent passages through foam-white chaos. More commonly, expeditions faced the laborious process of portaging, hauling their ships and entire cargoes overland around impassable sections. These portages required intimate cooperation with local Slavic tribes who controlled the territory and provided essential services: guides who knew safe paths, labourers to help carry heavy loads, and warriors to defend against the nomadic raiders who haunted these vulnerable stretches. The logistics of moving substantial trading expeditions through such challenging terrain demanded innovations in organisation and equipment. Scandinavian vessels operating in the eastern river systems evolved from their seagoing ancestors, becoming lighter, more manoeuvrable, and easier to portage when necessary. Cargo capacity was balanced against the need for rapid loading and unloading. Crews developed specialised techniques for traversing different types of obstacles, from negotiating shallow rapids to hauling vessels up steep riverbanks. Seasonal patterns governed the entire enterprise. Spring departures from Scandinavia took advantage of ice breakup and high water levels, but arrived in the Eastern Territories during the period when winter-hungry tribes were most likely to view passing expeditions as opportunities rather than trading partners. Summer travel offered safer passage through populated regions, but risked arriving in Constantinople during the Byzantine Empire's campaign season, when military priorities might override commercial interests. Autumn journeys faced the constant threat of early ice, which could trap expeditions far from friendly territory until spring thaw arrived months later. These seasonal constraints encouraged the development of permanent trading posts and fortifications along the major routes. What began as simple camps where expeditions could rest and resupply evolved into complex settlements that served multiple functions throughout the year. During travelling seasons, they provided essential services to passing merchants. During winter months, they served as bases for local trading with indigenous populations, manufacturing centres for goods demanded by southern markets, and diplomatic headquarters for maintaining relationships with tribal leaders. The settlement at Gnezdovo near modern Smolensk exemplified this evolution. Archaeological excavations have revealed a complex of burial mounds, workshops, and defensive works that testify to its importance as a regional centre. The site's strategic location at a portage between river systems made it an inevitable stopping point for expeditions travelling the full route. Over time, it developed into something resembling an urban centre, with specialised craftsmen producing goods specifically for the luxury trade, warriors providing security services, and administrators managing the complex relationships required to keep trade flowing. River-based naval tactics evolved to meet the unique challenges of inland warfare. Traditional Scandinavian naval techniques developed for open-sea combat proved inadequate for narrow waterways where manoeuvrability was limited and local knowledge could prove decisive. Successful river operations required smaller, more agile vessels. intimate cooperation with indigenous allies, and tactical flexibility that could adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The development of combined river and land operations became essential for controlling key strategic points along the trading routes. Expeditions learned to coordinate naval movements with overland forces, using their mobility advantage to strike at enemies who believed themselves safe behind traditional fortifications. The ability to appear suddenly at unexpected locations, attacking from directions that landbound forces could not easily defend, gave Scandinavian warriors significant tactical advantages over opponents accustomed to more conventional forms of warfare. These military innovations supported the growth of an extensive trading empire that connected northern Europe to markets in Constantinople and beyond. The range of goods flowing through this system testified to its geographical scope and economic sophistication. From the forests of northern Russia came the luxury furs that commanded extraordinary prices in southern markets: sable, ermine, marten, and fox pelts that would adorn the robes of Byzantine nobles and Islamic merchants. Amber from Baltic shores, that fossilized resin prized throughout the ancient world for its beauty and supposed magical properties, travelled south in carefully guarded shipments worth more than their weight in silver. The slave trade, though morally reprehensible by modern standards, represented one of the most lucrative aspects of the northern commerce. Scandinavian expeditions acquired slaves through warfare with hostile tribes, purchase from indigenous traders, and judicial proceedings that reduced criminals and debtors to bondage. These unfortunate individuals, torn from their families and native territories, were transported south to serve in Byzantine households, Islamic harems, and the agricultural enterprises that supported urban civilization throughout the Mediterranean world. Honey and beeswax from the vast forest regions provided essential commodities for both religious and secular purposes throughout medieval society. Churches required enormous quantities of wax for candles, while honey served as the primary sweetening agent in an age before sugar cultivation reached European markets. The scale of this trade is suggested by Arabic sources that describe Scandinavian merchants arriving in Bulgar with entire shiploads of honey and wax, goods that were then redistributed throughout the Islamic trading network. The southbound flow of northern products was matched by an equally valuable stream of exotic goods travelling towards Scandinavian markets. Byzantine silk, woven with techniques that remained closely guarded state secrets, represented the pinnacle of medieval textile achievement. A single bolt of imperial purple silk could purchase a farm, a ship, or a warrior's service for an entire season. Scandinavian graves from this period often contain silk fragments that testify to the wealth accumulated through Eastern trade. Spices from India and the Far East arrived via Constantinople, carrying flavours that could transform the simple cuisine of northern Europe. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other aromatic substances were literally worth their weight in silver, transforming the tables of successful merchants and jarls. These exotic flavours became symbols of status and sophistication, marking the difference between those who participated in the international trading economy and those who remained bound to local agricultural production. Islamic silver represented perhaps the most significant import, providing the monetary foundation for much of northern European commerce during this period. The Abbasid Caliphate's control of Central Asian silver mines generated enormous quantities of high-quality dirhams that found their way north through the complex trading network centered on the Volga River system. Archaeological evidence suggests that Islamic silver comprised the primary medium for major transactions throughout Scandinavia during the 9th and 10th centuries. Wine from Byzantine territories in the Mediterranean region provided another luxury that commanded high prices in northern markets. The grape cultivation that had flourished under Roman administration continued in Byzantine territories, producing wines that were considered superior to the fermented grain beverages common in northern Europe. Successful Scandinavian merchants and warriors developed tastes for southern wines that persisted even after their return to homeland territories. Religious artifacts represented a specialized but highly valuable category of trade goods. Byzantine icons, religious manuscripts, and ecclesiastical vessels found ready markets among the Christian populations of Eastern Europe, while pagan religious objects moved in the opposite direction to serve Scandinavian communities that had not yet converted to Christianity. This two-way flow of religious materials facilitated the gradual cultural exchanges that would ultimately transform the religious landscape of both regions. The economic impact of this Eastern trade on Scandinavian homelands was profound and lasting. Communities that had previously subsisted on agriculture and local crafts suddenly found themselves connected to international markets that could provide unprecedented wealth in exchange for products readily available in northern territories. This influx of silver and luxury goods transformed social structures, enabling the emergence of a merchant class that could challenge traditional warrior aristocracies for social and political influence. Proto-urban centres began developing throughout Scandinavia, as trade wealth concentrated in locations that could serve the specialised needs of long-distance commerce. Hedeby, Birka, and other trading settlements grew from seasonal markets to permanent communities, with specialised craftsmen, professional traders, and the complex social structures necessary to support sophisticated economic activities. These early urban centres served as intermediaries between the international trading networks and the rural communities that produced the goods demanded by southern markets. The relationship between Scandinavian traders and existing Slavic communities evolved from the simple exchange relationships of early contact periods to complex partnerships that transformed both cultures. Scandinavian settlements along the trading routes required cooperation with local populations for their basic survival, creating incentives for cultural adaptation and intermarriage that gradually blurred the distinctions between indigenous and immigrant communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that this cultural blending occurred rapidly in many regions. Burial practices began incorporating elements from both traditions, with Scandinavian weapons appearing alongside Slavic pottery and graves that also contained Byzantine coins and Islamic silver. Settlement patterns reflected both Scandinavian preferences for defensive positions controlling river routes and Slavic traditions of agricultural communities integrated with their surrounding territories. The legendary figures associated with this period of expansion reflect the complex relationship between historical fact and cultural memory. Rurik, the semi-mythical founder of the Russian dynasty, embodies the transformation of Scandinavian warrior traders into the rulers of Slavic territories. The chronicles that describe his calling by Slavic tribes seeking competent leadership probably reflect real political processes, though the specific details remain hopelessly entangled with later propaganda and myth-making. The narrative of Slavic tribes voluntarily inviting Scandinavian rulers to govern their territories appears in multiple sources but should be understood as a post hoc justification for political arrangements that probably developed through more complex and gradual processes. The actual establishment of Scandinavian political authority in Eastern European territories likely involved a combination of military conquest, negotiated settlements, intermarriage between ruling families, and the gradual assumption of administrative responsibilities by individuals who possessed the international connections and organizational skills necessary for managing complex trading relationships. Archaeological evidence for early rulers remains frustratingly limited, though several burial sites suggest the presence of individuals with both Scandinavian and local characteristics, who wielded considerable power and wealth. The famous burial at Nezdovo contains grave goods that suggest a warrior ruler with connections extending from Scandinavia to Byzantium, including weapons of Scandinavian manufacture, Byzantine silk, Islamic silver, and locally produced pottery and jewellery. Political organisation in early Varangian settlements appears to have adapted traditional Scandinavian practices to the different challenges presented by ruling multi-ethnic communities engaged in long-distance trade. The Thing assemblies that governed Scandinavian communities were modified to include representatives from various ethnic groups, while traditional concepts of personal loyalty to war leaders evolved to accommodate the more complex administrative demands of territorial governance. Cultural exchange and adaptation accelerated as Scandinavian communities established permanent roots in Eastern European territories. Language borrowings began flowing in both directions, with Slavic languages acquiring numerous terms related to trade, navigation, and political organisation from Old Norse, while Scandinavian communities adopted Slavic vocabulary for agricultural practices, local customs, and regional geographical features. Religious syncretism developed gradually as Scandinavian settlers encountered the complex religious landscape of Eastern Europe. Some Slavic territories had already been exposed to Christianity through contacts with the Byzantine Empire, while others maintained traditional pagan practices that shared certain similarities with Scandinavian beliefs. The result was a period of religious experimentation and adaptation that would ultimately facilitate the large-scale conversion to Christianity that occurred during the following century. Intermarriage between Scandinavian settlers and indigenous populations appears to have been common and accepted within both communities. Genetic evidence suggests substantial mixing between populations, while naming patterns preserved in later historical sources indicate that many prominent families traced their ancestry to unions between Scandinavian and Slavic partners. These marriages served important diplomatic and economic functions, cementing alliances between communities and facilitating the cultural knowledge transfer essential for successful adaptation to local conditions. The adoption of local customs and practices occurred selectively, with Scandinavian communities preserving elements of their cultural identity that provided practical advantages while adapting to local conditions in areas where flexibility enhanced their survival prospects. Burial practices gradually incorporated local elements while maintaining distinctively Scandinavian characteristics. Architecture blended Scandinavian defensive techniques with local building materials and climatic adaptations. Legal practices evolved to accommodate both Scandinavian concepts of personal honour and Slavic traditions of collective responsibility. Yet preservation of Scandinavian identity elements remained important for maintaining connections with homeland territories and distinguishing Varangian communities from their neighbours. Runic inscriptions continued to appear on personal objects and memorial stones, preserving literacy in Old Norse even as spoken languages began incorporating increasing numbers of Slavic terms. Traditional Scandinavian metalworking techniques continued to be practiced and passed down to new generations, maintaining craft traditions that provided both practical benefits and cultural continuity. The emergence of distinctively Varangian cultural syntheses during this period laid the foundation for the remarkable political and military achievements that would characterize the following centuries. Communities that successfully balanced cultural adaptation with identity preservation found themselves uniquely positioned to serve as intermediaries between different ethnic groups, religious traditions, and political systems. This cultural flexibility would prove essential for the establishment of the larger political structures that would define medieval Eastern Europe. The cultural syntheses that had emerged along the river trading routes during the 9th century created the foundation for something unprecedented in medieval Europe. A transcontinental state that would stretch from the Baltic forests to the Black Sea steppes, uniting dozens of Slavic, Finnic, and Turkic tribes under rulers whose Scandinavian ancestors had arrived as foreign traders just generations earlier. This transformation from loose confederations of trading posts into a coherent political entity centered around the city of Kiev represents one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural adaptation producing lasting institutional change. Kiev's rise to dominance was not inevitable. Several other settlements along the Dnieper route possessed apparent advantages that should have made them more likely candidates for political supremacy. Chernigov controlled access to the upper Dnieper from the east. Smolensk commanded the portages between river systems. Novgorod remained the gateway to Scandinavian homelands. Yet Kiev possessed one crucial advantage that ultimately proved decisive: its location at the point where the Dnieper route passed closest to the overland trading networks that connected the Black Sea region to Central Asia and the Islamic world. From Kiev's elevated position on the western bank of the Dnieper, traders could see for miles across the river and the steppes beyond. The site offered natural defensive advantages, with steep bluffs protecting it from direct assault, while the river itself served as a highway for both commerce and communication. Most importantly, Kiev stood at the last major stopping point before expeditions committed themselves to the dangerous passage through the Dnieper Rapids and the hostile steppe territories controlled by nomadic tribes. The man who transformed Kiev from regional trading centre to imperial capital was Oleg, a figure whose historical existence remains confirmed by archaeological evidence despite the legendary accretions that have obscured many details of his actual career. The primary chronicle describes him as Rurik's kinsman and successor, though the political arrangements that brought him to power were probably more complex than these later sources suggest. What seems clear from both textual and archaeological evidence is that Oleg possessed the military skill, diplomatic cunning, and administrative ability necessary to forge the diverse communities along the Dnieper route into something resembling a unified state. Oleg's consolidation of power required more than simple military conquest. The Slavic tribes scattered throughout the forest regions possessed their own military traditions and political structures that could not be simply swept aside. The Polian, who controlled the territory around Kiev, had already developed sophisticated agricultural and craft production systems. The Drevlian to the west maintained their own princely families and customary laws. The Severian to the northeast had established trading relationships with both the Kazakh Khaganate and the Bulgarian kingdoms that gave them alternatives to Scandinavian-dominated networks. Success in unifying these diverse groups required a combination of military pressure and diplomatic accommodation that would become characteristic of Varangian statecraft throughout the medieval period. Oleg's forces provided security against nomadic raiders from the steppes, protection that became increasingly valuable as climate change and political instability increased pressure on the sedentary agricultural populations of the forest regions. In exchange for this protection, tributary relationships were established that provided Kiev with the resources necessary to maintain professional military forces and administrative structures. The legendary account of Oleg's attack on Constantinople in 907, culminating in his hanging his shield on the gates of the imperial city, probably contains historical elements despite its obvious literary embellishments. Byzantine sources confirm that during this period the empire faced significant military pressure from northern barbarians, though the specific details recorded in later chronicles cannot be verified. What seems certain is that by the early 10th century, Varangian rulers had developed the military and logistical capabilities necessary to threaten even the heavily fortified capital of the Byzantine Empire. The psychological impact of such expeditions on both Varangian and Byzantine populations can hardly be overestimated. For the Scandinavian warriors who participated in these campaigns, attacking the greatest city in the medieval world represented the ultimate test of their martial prowess and the fulfillment of dreams that had motivated their ancestors to leave northern homelands. For the Byzantines, the appearance of northern fleets before their capital demonstrated that their empire's traditional defensive advantages were no longer sufficient to guarantee security against determined enemies. Yet these military expeditions served diplomatic as well as military purposes. The treaties negotiated following Oleg's campaigns established formal trading relationships that benefited both parties. Byzantine markets gained access to northern products that were essential for imperial luxury and international trade, while Varangian merchants received guaranteed access to the most sophisticated commercial system in medieval Europe. These agreements represented recognition by the Byzantine Empire that the Varangian principalities had achieved sufficient political sophistication to serve as reliable diplomatic partners. The development of tributary relationships throughout the territories under Kiev's influence required administrative innovations that adapted Scandinavian political traditions to the challenges of governing settled agricultural populations. The traditional Scandinavian system of personal loyalty between war leaders and their followers had to be modified to accommodate the territorial administration required for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and coordinating defense against external enemies. Archaeological evidence suggests that this administrative system relied heavily on existing Slavic political structures while introducing Scandinavian military and commercial expertise. Local chiefs retained authority over their immediate territories and populations, but acknowledged the supremacy of Kiev's rulers in matters of external relations, military service, and tribute payment. This arrangement allowed for considerable local autonomy, while providing the central authority with the resources necessary for maintaining professional armed forces and conducting international diplomacy. Legal innovations accompanied these political developments, though the specific details of early legal codes remain obscure due to limited textual evidence from this period. What seems clear is that Varangian rulers recognized the need to reconcile different legal traditions. Scandinavian concepts of personal honor and compensation, Slavic customary law based on collective responsibility, and Byzantine legal principles encountered through trading and diplomatic contacts. The synthesis that emerged would eventually be codified in later legal documents, but its foundations were probably established during this period of initial state formation. The transition from Oleg's reign to that of his successor Igor marked the beginning of dynastic politics that would characterize Varangian statecraft for centuries. Igor's accession appears to have been contested, suggesting that succession practices had not yet been definitively established. The primary chronicle describes conflicts between different claimants and the military campaigns necessary to maintain Kiev's dominance over tributary territories, conflicts that probably reflected both external pressures and internal disputes over the proper organization of political authority. Igor's reign was marked by continued military campaigns aimed at expanding and consolidating territorial control. Expeditions against the Drevlian and other Slavic tribes served to maintain tribute relationships that provided the economic foundation for Kiev's power. At the same time, campaigns against nomadic groups from the steppes protected the agricultural populations that formed the demographic basis of the emerging state. These dual military priorities, internal consolidation and external defense, would remain characteristic of Varangian statecraft throughout the medieval period. The tragic end of Igor's life, killed while attempting to collect additional tribute from the Drevlian, illustrated both the potential and the limitations of early Varangian political authority. The incident demonstrates that tributary relationships remained contested and required constant military enforcement. At the same time, the Drevlians' willingness to kill an established ruler suggests that Varangian authority, while real, had not yet achieved the kind of legitimacy that would make resistance unthinkable. Igor's death also marked the beginning of one of medieval Europe's most remarkable political careers. His widow Olga assumed regency for their young son Sviatoslav and proved herself capable of wielding power with a skill that impressed even contemporary chroniclers, who generally displayed little interest in women's political activities. Olga's revenge against the Drevlian, while brutal by modern standards, established important precedents for how Kiev's rulers would respond to challenges to their authority. More significantly, for long-term political development, Olga's conversion to Christianity during the 950s represented the first serious engagement by a Varangian ruler with the religious transformation that was beginning to reshape medieval European politics. Her journey to Constantinople, where she was baptized in the presence of the Byzantine emperor, established diplomatic and cultural connections that would prove crucial for subsequent developments. Olga's conversion should be understood as a political decision based on careful analysis of changing circumstances, rather than as a purely personal religious experience. By the 10th century, Christianity was expanding throughout Eastern Europe, carried by Byzantine missionaries, Western European merchants, and local populations that found Christian theology and social organization attractive alternatives to traditional pagan practices. Olga's conversion positioned Kiev to participate in these broader cultural changes while maintaining its political independence. The diplomatic marriages arranged during Olga's regency demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international politics. Marriage alliances with Hungarian, Polish, and Byzantine ruling families created networks of mutual obligation and support that enhanced Kiev's security, while establishing its rulers as legitimate participants in medieval European diplomacy. These marriages also facilitated cultural exchange that would prove crucial for the administrative and intellectual development of the Kievan state. Yet Olga's Christian conversion and diplomatic initiatives met considerable resistance from traditional elements within Varangian society. When her son Sviatoslav reached maturity and assumed direct rule, he deliberately rejected his mother's Christian faith and pursued policies that emphasized traditional Scandinavian warrior values over the Christian diplomacy that Olga had favored. This generational conflict reflected broader tensions within Varangian society between those who favored cultural adaptation and integration with surrounding populations and those who sought to preserve traditional Nordic identity and practices. Sviatoslav's warrior ethos manifested itself in almost constant military campaigning that extended Kiev's influence far beyond its traditional territories while creating new enemies and strategic complications. His campaigns against the Khazar Khaganate successfully eliminated a major rival for control of eastern trade routes, but also removed a buffer that had previously protected Kiev's territories from direct nomadic pressure. His Bulgarian campaigns demonstrated Kiev's military capabilities while entangling the state in Byzantine politics that would prove difficult to manage. The challenges of ruling a multi-ethnic state became particularly acute during Sviatoslav's reign. His preference for military campaigning over domestic administration left local governance largely in the hands of subordinate officials whose loyalties were not always reliable. The diverse populations under Kiev's authority maintained their own cultural traditions, legal systems, and political preferences that could not be simply ignored or suppressed without risking rebellion. Successful governance required constant attention to maintaining the delicate balance between different ethnic and regional interests. Sviatoslav's death in 972, killed by Pecheneg nomads while returning from his Bulgarian campaigns, precipitated a succession crisis that nearly destroyed the political unity that previous generations had worked to create. The conflict between his sons Vladimir and Yaropolk involved not just dynastic rivalry, but fundamental disagreements about the future direction of Varangian statecraft. Yaropolk appears to have favoured closer ties with Western European Christian kingdoms, while Vladimir initially supported traditional pagan practices and military expansion. Vladimir's ultimate victory in the succession struggle marked the beginning of the most transformative period in the history of the Kievan state. His early reign witnessed a deliberate revival of pagan practices that seemed to reject his grandmother Olga's Christian initiatives. The construction of a great pagan temple in Kiev, complete with idols representing the gods of different ethnic groups within the state, represented an attempt to create a syncretic religious system that could unite his diverse subjects while maintaining connection to traditional Scandinavian beliefs. The practice of human sacrifice associated with this pagan revival horrified contemporary Christian observers and probably reflected both religious conviction and political calculation. Public religious ceremonies that included human sacrifice served to demonstrate state power, while providing opportunities for displaying wealth and distributing gifts that reinforced political loyalties. At the same time, these practices created barriers to diplomatic relations with Christian kingdoms that were becoming increasingly important for Kiev's international position. The legendary account of Vladimir's consideration of different religious options, Islam, Judaism, Western Christianity and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, probably reflects real political deliberations about the religious direction of the state, though the specific details recorded in later chronicles are obviously influenced by subsequent events. What seems clear is that Vladimir and his advisors recognized that religious conversion would have profound political, economic and cultural implications that required careful consideration. The political calculations behind Vladimir's ultimate choice of Eastern Orthodox Christianity were complex and far-reaching. Alliance with the Byzantine Empire offered immediate military advantages, as demonstrated by Vladimir's assistance in suppressing the rebellion of Bardas Phocas in exchange for marriage to the emperor's sister Anna. This marriage alliance represented unprecedented recognition of Kiev's international status, while establishing formal diplomatic relationships that would prove crucial for subsequent political development. From an economic perspective, closer ties with Byzantium promised enhanced access to the most sophisticated trading networks in medieval Europe. Christian conversion would also facilitate diplomatic relations with other Christian kingdoms, while removing religious barriers that had previously limited Kiev's international options. Perhaps most importantly, Christianity offered administrative and cultural resources that could enhance the effectiveness of territorial governance over increasingly complex and diverse populations. The baptism of Kiev in 988 represented one of medieval Europe's most dramatic religious transformations. The mass conversion of the population, enforced by Vladimir's orders but apparently accepted with relatively little resistance, suggests that Christianity had already gained considerable popular support through previous missionary activities and cultural contacts. The destruction of pagan idols and their replacement with Christian churches marked not just religious change but the beginning of architectural and artistic developments that would define Kievan culture for centuries. The construction of churches and monasteries throughout Vladimir's territories served multiple purposes beyond purely religious functions. These institutions provided centers for education and literacy that enhanced administrative capabilities, while serving as repositories for cultural knowledge and artistic traditions. Monasteries became centers for manuscript production and preservation, activities that created the literary foundation for later cultural achievements. The economic activities of religious institutions, agriculture, craft production and trade, contributed significantly to overall economic development. The cultural implications of mass Christianization extended far beyond religious practices themselves. Christian theology provided intellectual frameworks for understanding political authority, legal obligation, and social responsibility that enhanced governmental effectiveness while legitimizing hierarchical social structures. Christian marriage customs and family organization influenced inheritance practices and property relationships in ways that strengthened political stability. Christian concepts of universal brotherhood created ideological foundations for unity among diverse ethnic groups that had previously been unified primarily through military conquest. Yet the transition to Christianity also created new challenges for maintaining Varangian cultural identity. Christian practices often conflicted with traditional Scandinavian customs related to warfare, social organization, and personal honor. The pacifist elements of Christian theology sat uneasily with warrior culture that had provided the foundation for Varangian political success. Reconciling these conflicting value systems required theological and practical compromises that would influence Varangian culture for generations. Vladimir's reign also witnessed significant urban development that reflected both economic prosperity and administrative sophistication. Kiev grew from a fortified trading post into a genuine medieval city with specialized districts for different craft activities, religious institutions and residential areas organized according to social and ethnic distinctions. Archaeological evidence suggests that the city's population during this period may have reached 50,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest urban centers in medieval Europe. The succession of Vladimir's son Yaroslav in 1019, following another dynastic conflict that demonstrated the persistent challenges of maintaining political unity, marked the beginning of what historians traditionally consider the golden age of Kievan civilization. Yaroslav's long reign, 1019 to 1054, provided the political stability necessary for cultural achievements that would define medieval Eastern European civilization for centuries. The codification of legal practices in the Ruskaya Pravda represented one of Yaroslav's most lasting achievements. This legal code, while building on earlier customary practices, established written standards for criminal prosecution, property rights, and commercial relationships that enhance governmental effectiveness while providing legal security for subjects engaged in long-distance trade and complex commercial activities. The Code's provisions reveal a sophisticated understanding of the legal requirements for governing multi-ethnic populations engaged in diverse economic activities. Cultural flowering during Yaroslav's reign manifested itself in architectural achievements that rivaled anything in contemporary Western Europe. The construction of St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev, inspired by its namesake in Constantinople but adapted to local conditions and preferences, demonstrated both artistic sophistication and economic prosperity. The cathedral's mosaics and frescoes, created by Byzantine artists working alongside local craftsmen, established artistic traditions that would influence Eastern European religious art for centuries. Literary development during this period laid the foundation for distinctive traditions of historical writing and religious reflection that distinguished Kievan culture from both its Scandinavian origins and Byzantine models. The primary chronicle, compiled during the early 12th century but drawing on earlier sources, represents one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated attempts to understand the historical development of a multi-ethnic state. Homiletic literature produced by Kievan authors demonstrated theological sophistication while addressing practical concerns about Christian living in societies that retained many pre-Christian cultural elements. International marriages arranged during Yaroslav's reign testified to Kiev's acceptance as a major European power while creating diplomatic networks that enhanced political security. Yaroslav's daughters married the kings of France, Hungary, and Norway, while his sons formed marriage alliances with Polish, Byzantine, and other royal families. These relationships placed Kiev at the centre of medieval European diplomacy, while facilitating cultural exchange that enriched Kievan intellectual and artistic life. Urban development throughout Kiev's territories during Yaroslav's reign reflected both administrative sophistication and economic prosperity. Cities like Novgorod, Chernigov, and Pereyaslavl developed distinctive architectural styles and economic specializations while maintaining connections to international trading networks. The growth of urban populations supported craft specialization and cultural activities that enhanced the overall sophistication of Kievan civilization. Yet by the mid-11th century, the limits of Varangian identity were becoming increasingly apparent. Third- and fourth-generation descendants of Scandinavian settlers spoke Slavic languages as their native tongues, while maintaining only ceremonial connections to their northern origins. Intermarriage with local populations had created ruling families whose ethnic composition defied simple categorization as either Scandinavian or Slavic. Cultural practices had evolved to accommodate Christian theology and Byzantine administrative practices while retaining only nostalgic connections to pagan Scandinavian traditions. The transformation was most evident in military organization and tactics. The ship-based raiding that had characterized early Varangian expansion gave way to cavalry-heavy armies organized according to steppe nomadic models and equipped with weapons and armor produced by local craftsmen working in international styles. The river routes that had originally defined Varangian expansion were now controlled by established urban centers whose populations pursued diverse economic activities, rather than focusing primarily on long-distance trade. Religious conversion had created new cultural connections that transcended ethnic boundaries, while establishing intellectual frameworks that facilitated political integration among diverse populations. The Orthodox Christianity that had been adopted from Byzantium was being adapted to local conditions and preferences in ways that created distinctively Kievan theological and liturgical traditions. Monastic communities that had been established to preserve Christian culture were developing educational and literary activities that drew inspiration from multiple cultural traditions. Political institutions that had evolved from Scandinavian warbands were becoming territorial administrations, responsible for governing settled agricultural populations whose needs and interests differed significantly from those of mobile warrior societies. Legal systems were incorporating Christian concepts of justice and social responsibility, while maintaining customary practices that reflected local conditions and ethnic traditions. Diplomatic relationships were being conducted according to medieval European protocols, while serving political interests that extended far beyond traditional Scandinavian concerns. By Yaroslav's death in 1054, the Kievan state had achieved remarkable political, economic, and cultural success, while undergoing fundamental transformation from its Scandinavian origins. The river routes that had originally carried small bands of Scandinavian adventurers into unknown territories now supported sophisticated trading networks connecting multiple urban centres with international markets. The tributary relationships that had begun as simple protection arrangements had evolved into complex administrative systems governing diverse populations across vast territories. The Golden Age of Kievan civilization represented both the culmination of Varangian political achievements and the completion of their cultural transformation. The rulers who governed from Kiev's palace complexes bore Scandinavian names, but thought in Slavic languages and ruled according to Christian principles adapted to local conditions. Their subjects included descendants of multiple ethnic groups who had found unity through shared political institutions and religious beliefs, rather than common ancestry or cultural traditions. This transformation would prove both a source of strength and a potential weakness as the Kievan state faced new challenges in subsequent generations. The cultural flexibility that had enabled successful adaptation to local conditions had also reduced the distinctive characteristics that had originally distinguished Varangian communities from their neighbours. The political unity that had been achieved through personal loyalty to successful war leaders was being tested by the more complex demands of territorial administration and multi-ethnic governance that characterized mature medieval kingdoms. While the descendants of Rurik and Oleg were transforming themselves into Christian princes ruling Slavic territories from the throne rooms of Kiev, another branch of the Varangian diaspora was carving out a very different destiny in the marble halls and golden chambers of Constantinople. Here, in the greatest city of the medieval world, Scandinavian warriors would serve not as rulers, but as the ultimate guardians of imperial power, their Nordic axes glinting in the shadows of Hagia Sophia as they stood watch over emperors who claimed descent from Caesar Augustus himself. The origins of what would become the legendary Varangian Guard lay in the pragmatic military needs of the Byzantine Empire during the late 10th century. Emperor Basil II, faced with a series of dangerous rebellions that threatened to tear his realm apart, recognized that his traditional military forces had become unreliable. Too many of his generals commanded personal loyalties that superseded their allegiance to the imperial throne. Too many of his soldiers came from provinces that harboured their own political ambitions. What the emperor needed was a military force with no local connections, no personal stake in Byzantine political rivalries, and no alternative loyalties that might compromise their dedication to imperial service. The solution came from an unexpected source. Vladimir of Kiev, recently converted to Christianity and newly married to the emperor's sister Anna, possessed exactly what Basil required: a substantial force of professional warriors whose only loyalty was to their immediate commander and whose only interest in Byzantine politics was the gold that imperial service could provide. The initial contingent of 6,000 Varangian warriors who arrived in Constantinople around 988 represented the foundation of what would become medieval Europe's most elite military unit. These first Varangian guards were not the romantic figures of later legend, but hard-bitten professionals who had survived the brutal campaigns that established Kiev's dominance over the Dnieper territories. They carried weapons forged in Scandinavian workshops, spoke languages that mixed Norse with Slavic borrowings, and practiced fighting techniques adapted to the river warfare that had defined their previous military experience. Their arrival in Constantinople marked the beginning of a cultural encounter that would transform both the guards themselves and the imperial institution they served. The axe-bearing Northmen who took up positions around the imperial palace brought with them more than military skill. They carried the cultural memory of societies where personal honour mattered more than political expediency, where loyalty to a war leader created bonds stronger than blood kinship, where courage in battle provided the only reliable path to social advancement. These values, transplanted into the sophisticated political environment of Byzantium, created a military force that combined Northern European martial traditions with Mediterranean strategic sophistication. Initial military roles for the Varangian Guard reflected both their foreign origins and their specialized capabilities. They served as the emperor's personal bodyguard during public ceremonies, their distinctive weapons and foreign appearance serving to emphasize imperial power while deterring potential assassins. They provided security for the imperial palace complex, their lack of local connections making them immune to the bribes and political pressures that might compromise native guards. Most importantly, they served as a strategic reserve during military campaigns, their reputation for fierce loyalty and combat effectiveness making them valuable for critical missions where failure could not be tolerated. Ceremonial duties occupied much of the guard's time during periods of relative peace. Byzantine imperial protocol required elaborate public displays that demonstrated the emperor's divine authority and earthly power. The Varangian Guard participated in these ceremonies not as decorative elements, but as visible symbols of the emperor's ability to command loyalty from the most feared warriors in medieval Europe. Their presence at coronations, religious festivals, and diplomatic receptions reinforced imperial prestige while providing practical security against the constant threats that surrounded medieval rulers. Living conditions for the guards reflected both their elite status and their foreign origins. They occupied their own quarters within the palace complex, maintaining separate mess halls, training grounds, and recreational facilities that allowed them to preserve elements of their northern European culture while adapting to life in the Mediterranean world. Archaeological evidence from the palace district suggests that Varangian quarters included workshops where guards could maintain their distinctive weapons and equipment, as well as communal areas where traditional northern European social activities could continue. Compensation for guard service extended far beyond simple military pay. Guards received substantial cash payments, supplemented by shares of booty from successful military campaigns, and opportunities for profitable trading activities during off-duty periods. Perhaps most importantly, guards who completed their service terms received citizenship rights and land grants that could provide the foundation for comfortable retirement. Many former guards established themselves as merchants or landowners in Byzantine territories, using the wealth and connections acquired through imperial service to build successful civilian careers. The influx of Norwegian warriors under Harald Hardrada during the 1030s marked a significant expansion in both the size and capabilities of the Varangian Guard. Harald, later known as Harald the Hard Ruler, who would die attempting to conquer England in 1066, arrived in Constantinople as a young exile, seeking his fortune far from the political chaos that plagued his Norwegian homeland. His military genius and charismatic leadership transformed the Guard from a competent palace security force into an elite military unit capable of independent operations in the most challenging theatres of Byzantine warfare. Under Harald's leadership, the Guard developed recruitment practices that attracted the finest warriors from throughout northern Europe. Service in Constantinople became the ultimate test of martial skill and personal courage, drawing young men who sought to prove themselves worthy of the sagas that celebrated heroic achievement. The Guard maintained agents in Scandinavia who identified promising candidates, while its reputation ensured a steady stream of volunteers seeking admission to its ranks. Service terms were typically established at fixed periods, often 7 to 10 years, allowing guards to accumulate substantial wealth while maintaining connections to their northern homelands. This rotation system ensured that the Guard retained its distinctive northern European character, while providing individuals with opportunities to return home as wealthy and experienced veterans. Many former guards used their Byzantine experience to establish themselves as military leaders in their native territories, carrying knowledge of advanced military techniques and political organization back to Scandinavia. Military campaigns during the Guard's early decades established its reputation as the most effective military force in the Byzantine arsenal. The conquest of Bulgaria under Basil Seth showcased the Guard's ability to operate in difficult terrain against determined opponents, while campaigns in Asia Minor demonstrated their adaptability to different types of warfare. The Guard's tactical flexibility, combining traditional northern European shock tactics with Byzantine strategic doctrine, proved particularly effective against enemies who had prepared to face conventional imperial forces. The Norman Wars in southern Italy provided the Guard with its greatest military challenges and most spectacular victories. The Norman adventurers who had established themselves in Sicily and southern Italy possessed military capabilities similar to those of the Guard itself, creating conflicts that tested both tactical skill and personal courage. Harald Hardrada's campaigns against the Normans became legendary throughout medieval Europe, establishing the Guard's reputation while demonstrating the military potential of properly organized northern European warriors. Campaigns in Asia Minor and the Caucasus exposed the Guard to military traditions and fighting techniques that differed significantly from those encountered in European theatres. Mountain warfare against Georgian and Armenian opponents required adaptation of traditional tactics, while desert campaigns against Arab forces demanded new approaches to logistics and supply. These diverse military experiences enhanced the Guard's effectiveness, while contributing to the personal development of individual warriors who would later apply their knowledge in other contexts. The Guard's role in imperial succession crises became increasingly important as Byzantine political stability deteriorated during the 11th and 12th centuries. Their foreign origins and lack of local political connections made them valuable allies for emperors facing challenges from ambitious generals or provincial governors. At the same time, their military effectiveness meant that their support could prove decisive in conflicts where traditional sources of imperial authority had been compromised. During the Crusades, the Varangian Guard found itself in the peculiar position of serving a Christian emperor against fellow Christians from Western Europe, while also fighting alongside Western European crusaders against Muslim opponents. These complex political arrangements required diplomatic skills that complemented military effectiveness, as guards had to navigate relationships with Frankish nobles, Italian merchants, and various Eastern Christian communities that possessed different political goals and religious priorities. Interactions with other imperial military units reflected both the guards' elite status and the practical challenges of integrating foreign warriors into the Byzantine military system. Traditional themes, provincial military districts, provided locally recruited soldiers who understood regional conditions but whose loyalties were often divided. Mercenary units from various ethnic backgrounds offered specialized capabilities but lacked the institutional loyalty that characterized the Guard. The result was a military system that required constant attention to maintaining proper relationships between different types of forces. Daily life in Constantinople exposed the Guards to cultural influences that gradually transformed their northern European origins while maintaining their distinctive military identity. Barracks life combined military discipline with opportunities for education and cultural enrichment that were unavailable in their Scandinavian homelands. Many Guards learned to read and write in Greek, acquiring literacy that enhanced their value as administrators and diplomats. Others developed artistic and commercial skills that complemented their military capabilities. Relationships with local populations evolved from initial mutual suspicion to complex patterns of integration and cultural exchange. Guards who served multiple terms often formed lasting relationships with Byzantine civilians, leading to intermarriage and the establishment of families that blended Northern European and Byzantine cultural elements. Children from these unions grew up speaking both Greek and Old Norse, practicing both Orthodox Christianity and maintaining connections to Northern European cultural traditions. Preservation of Norse customs and language within the Guard became increasingly challenging, as successive generations of Guards spent longer periods in Byzantine territories. Special efforts were made to maintain traditional festivals, storytelling practices, and martial customs that defined Northern European cultural identity. Runic inscriptions from this period, carved on walls throughout Constantinople, testify to the Guard's determination to preserve literary traditions while adapting to new cultural environments. Religious practices within the Guard reflected the complex theological and political relationships between different branches of Christianity during the medieval period. Most Guards arrived in Constantinople as recent converts to Christianity, carrying religious understanding that had been shaped by the particular circumstances of Northern European conversion. Exposure to Orthodox theology and Byzantine religious practices created opportunities for deeper Christian education, while raising questions about the relationship between different Christian traditions. Conversion patterns within the Guard varied according to individual circumstances and personal preferences. Some Guards embraced Orthodox Christianity enthusiastically, finding in Byzantine theological traditions a sophistication that exceeded what they had encountered in their homelands. Others maintained more superficial religious conformity, while preserving elements of traditional Northern European beliefs and practices. Still others developed syncretic religious approaches that combined Christian theology with traditional concepts of honor, loyalty, and heroic achievement. Economic activities beyond military service provided Guards with opportunities for wealth accumulation that extended far beyond their official compensation. Many Guards engaged in trading activities that took advantage of their unique position at the center of international commerce, using their military skills to provide security for merchant expeditions while investing their own capital in commercial ventures. Others developed craft skills that produced goods demanded by both military and civilian markets. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 created an unexpected influx of Anglo-Saxon warriors seeking service in the Varangian Guard, fundamentally altering its composition and cultural character. The arrival of English refugees, led by nobles who had lost their lands to Norman conquerors, introduced new military traditions and cultural perspectives that both enriched and complicated the Guard's Northern European identity. English additions to the Guard brought military experience gained from different types of warfare than those that had shaped Scandinavian martial traditions. Anglo-Saxon tactics, developed through generations of conflict with Danish and Norwegian invaders, emphasized defensive formations and siege warfare techniques that complemented the more aggressive approaches favored by Scandinavian Guards. The integration of these different military traditions enhanced the Guard's overall effectiveness, while creating internal tensions between different national groups. Cultural tensions between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon elements within the Guard reflected broader political conflicts that had shaped Northern European history for centuries. English Guards brought memories of Viking raids and Danish occupation, that complicated relationships with guards whose ancestors had participated in these same conflicts. Overcoming these historical grievances required leadership that could emphasize shared Christian identity and common military purpose while respecting the legitimate pride that different national groups took in their ancestral achievements. Changes in guard composition during the late 11th and 12th centuries reflected both the Anglo-Saxon influx and broader changes in European military organization. The increasing sophistication of Western European military techniques, particularly developments in cavalry tactics and siege warfare, required adaptation of guard training and equipment. At the same time, the declining availability of traditional Scandinavian recruits, as northern European kingdoms developed their own professional military forces, forced the Guard to seek warriors from a broader range of ethnic backgrounds. The gradual decline of Scandinavian elements within the Guard occurred over several generations, as changing political and economic conditions in northern Europe reduced the incentives for military service in distant lands. The development of more centralized kingdoms in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden created local opportunities for military advancement that competed with Byzantine service. Simultaneously, the increasing wealth and cultural sophistication of Scandinavian societies reduced the relative attractiveness of foreign military service. The Fourth Crusade of 1204, which resulted in the sack of Constantinople, and the temporary collapse of the Byzantine Empire, marked the beginning of the Guard's final transformation from an elite military force to a largely ceremonial institution. The establishment of the Latin Empire of Constantinople disrupted traditional recruitment patterns, while eliminating many of the political and economic incentives that had motivated Northern European military service. Although the Guard was reconstituted following the Byzantine Restoration in 1261, it never regained its former military significance. Changing military needs and tactics during the 13th and 14th centuries reduced the strategic value of the Guard's traditional capabilities. The development of more sophisticated siege techniques, the increasing importance of naval warfare, and the evolution of heavy cavalry tactics diminished the tactical advantages that had made Northern European warriors particularly valuable to Byzantine military planners. The Guard's ceremonial functions remained important for imperial prestige, but its military role became increasingly marginalized. The last known Varangian Guards served during the final centuries of Byzantine independence, maintaining their ceremonial duties even as the empire contracted to little more than the city of Constantinople itself. These final guards bore little resemblance to their 10th century predecessors, serving more as palace officials than as warriors, while preserving only the most formal elements of their northern European heritage. Their presence in imperial ceremonies represented continuity with past greatness rather than contemporary military capability. Transformation into a ceremonial force reflected broader changes in medieval military organization, as well as the specific circumstances of Byzantine decline. Professional military forces throughout Europe were becoming more specialized and technically sophisticated, reducing the value of traditional warrior skills while increasing the importance of engineering, logistics, and administrative capabilities. The Guard's transformation paralleled similar changes in military institutions throughout medieval Europe. The legacy of the Varangian Guard in Byzantine military tradition extended far beyond its specific tactical contributions. The Guard's example demonstrated the potential value of incorporating foreign military traditions into existing institutional structures, while its service record provided models for military professionalism and institutional loyalty that influenced Byzantine military development for centuries. Even after the Guard itself had ceased to exist as a meaningful military force, its historical example continued to influence Byzantine military thinking and organization. The cultural legacy of the Guard proved equally significant for both Byzantine and Northern European civilizations. For Byzantium, the Guard's service demonstrated the empire's continued ability to attract and command loyalty from the finest warriors in medieval Europe, while their cultural contributions enriched Byzantine intellectual and artistic life. For Northern Europe, former Guards returned home with knowledge of advanced military techniques, political organization, and cultural sophistication that influenced the development of emerging kingdoms throughout Scandinavia and the British Isles. Individual Guards who completed their service and returned to Northern Europe often achieved positions of political and military leadership that allowed them to apply their Byzantine experience in new contexts. Harald Hardrada's later career as King of Norway represented only the most famous example of this pattern, as dozens of former Guards used their wealth, experience, and connections to establish themselves as influential figures in their native territories. The knowledge and skills they brought home contributed significantly to the political and military development of medieval Northern Europe. By the 14th century, the transformation of the Varangian Guard from elite military force to ceremonial institution was complete. The guards who participated in the final imperial ceremonies bore mainly ceremonial weapons, performed largely ritual duties, and preserved only the most superficial elements of their Northern European heritage. Yet their continued presence in imperial protocol testified to the enduring significance of their predecessors' service and the lasting impact of the cultural encounter between Northern European warriors and Byzantine civilization. The story of the Varangian Guard represents one of medieval Europe's most successful examples of cross-cultural military cooperation. For over 3 centuries, warriors from the forests and fjords of northern Europe served emperors whose ancestry traced back to ancient Rome, protecting the last remnant of classical civilization while adapting their own cultural traditions to the sophisticated political environment of medieval Byzantium. Their service created bonds between different European civilizations while demonstrating the potential for cultural adaptation and institutional innovation that would characterize the best aspects of medieval European development. While Varangian warriors were carving their names into the marble columns of Hagia Sophia and standing guard over Byzantine emperors, the river routes they had pioneered were transforming into arteries of commerce that would reshape the economic geography of medieval Europe. The same waterways that had carried battle-hungry young men south toward Constantinople now pulsed with merchant vessels whose holds groaned beneath loads of silver coins, silk bolts, amber beads, and exotic spices. What had begun as seasonal raiding expeditions had evolved into sophisticated trading networks that connected the pine forests of Scandinavia to the bazaars of Baghdad, creating wealth on a scale that would have seemed impossible to the first Norse adventurers who had descended the Volkhov Rapids 2 centuries earlier. The northern silver route that emerged during the 9th and 10th centuries represented one of medieval Europe's most significant economic developments, though its importance would only become fully apparent to modern historians through archaeological discoveries made centuries later. The Islamic world, flush with silver extracted from the mines of Central Asia, generated enormous quantities of high-quality dirhams that found their way northward through an intricate web of commercial relationships that stretched across thousands of miles of rivers, forests, and steppes. The journey of Islamic silver northward began in the great mining centres of Khorasan and Transoxiana, where Persian and Arab engineers employed sophisticated techniques to extract precious metals from mountainous terrain that challenged even experienced miners. These silver deposits, discovered during the early centuries of Islamic expansion, provided the monetary foundation for the Abbasid Caliphate's unprecedented prosperity during the 8th and 9th centuries. The quality of silver produced in these mines exceeded anything available in contemporary Europe, creating coins whose purity and consistent weight made them the preferred medium for international commerce throughout much of the medieval world. From the mints of Baghdad, Samarkand, and other Islamic commercial centres, silver coins moved northward along established caravan routes that connected the Islamic world to the nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes. Volga-Bulgarian merchants, positioned at the crucial junction between the steppe caravan routes and the river networks leading to Scandinavia, served as intermediaries who facilitated exchange between civilizations whose representatives rarely met face-to-face. These Bulgarian traders, themselves converts to Islam who maintained commercial relationships with both Islamic merchants and northern European traders, created the crucial commercial links that made the northern silver route possible. The scale of silver movement northward during this period staggers the modern imagination. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian silver hoards suggests that hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of Islamic silver coins reached northern Europe between the 9th and 11th centuries. Individual hoards discovered in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway often contain thousands of coins representing decades of accumulated wealth, while the geographic distribution of these discoveries reveals the extent to which Islamic silver penetrated throughout northern European society. The economic impact on Scandinavia was revolutionary. Communities that had previously operated largely outside the monetary economy suddenly found themselves connected to international markets that could provide unprecedented wealth in exchange for products readily available in northern territories. The fur trade, which had provided modest profits for generations of hunters and trappers, became the foundation for fortunes that rivaled those of southern European nobility. Amber gathering along Baltic shores evolved from subsistence activity to commercial enterprise that could support specialized craftsmen and professional traders. The transformation of Scandinavian society under the influence of silver wealth manifested itself in numerous ways, that archaeological evidence has only recently begun to reveal. Burial practices changed dramatically as successful traders and warriors were interred with quantities of silver that would have represented impossible wealth for earlier generations. The famous silver armorings found in many Scandinavian graves from this period served both as personal ornaments and as portable wealth that could be cut into measured pieces for use in commercial transactions. Craft production throughout Scandinavia adapted to serve markets created by silver wealth. Silversmiths developed sophisticated techniques for working with the high-quality metal provided by Islamic coins, creating jewellery and decorative objects that combined traditional Northern European artistic motifs with technical skills learned through contact with more advanced metalworking traditions. The distinctive animal-style art that characterised Scandinavian craft production during this period often incorporated silver elements that had been melted down from Islamic coins, creating artistic syntheses that reflected the cultural complexity of the northern silver trade. Archaeological evidence from silver hoards provides unprecedented insights into the mechanics of medieval international commerce. The consistent weight and purity of Islamic coins facilitated commercial calculations that would have been impossible with the crude silver bars and ornaments that had previously served as media of exchange in Northern Europe. At the same time, the practice of cutting coins into fragments for smaller transactions created distinctive archaeological signatures that allow modern scholars to trace the geographic distribution and chronological development of the silver trade. Monetary systems throughout Northern Europe evolved to accommodate the influx of Islamic silver while maintaining compatibility with local commercial practices. Weight standards based on Islamic models were adapted to Northern European needs, creating measurement systems that could handle both the high-value transactions made possible by silver wealth and the smaller-scale exchanges that characterize local commerce. The development of balance scales and standardized weights represented technological innovations that enhanced commercial efficiency while creating new opportunities for fraud and commercial disputes. The environmental impact of Central Asian silver mining, while not immediately apparent to medieval contemporaries, represented one of the most significant ecological consequences of the northern silver trade. The extraction techniques employed in Islamic mining operations generated enormous quantities of waste material that contaminated water supplies and degraded agricultural land throughout the affected regions. The scale of mining required to supply the Northern European silver trade contributed to deforestation and soil erosion that affected the carrying capacity of mountain regions for generations. The wealth generated by silver trade created the economic foundation for urban development throughout the territories controlled by Varangian princes and merchants. Cities that had begun as simple trading posts evolved into complex commercial and administrative centres that could support specialised crafts production, religious institutions, and the cultural activities that characterized mature medieval civilization. The transformation of settlements like Novgorod, Staraya Ladoga, and Smolensk from seasonal markets to permanent urban centres represented one of the most significant demographic and economic changes in medieval European history. Novgorod the Great emerged during this period as perhaps medieval Europe's most remarkable example of a commercial republic. Unlike the feudal monarchies that characterized most of contemporary Europe, Novgorod developed political institutions that reflected the commercial interests and democratic traditions of its merchant class. The city's popular assembly, the Veche, made decisions about taxation, military campaigns, and foreign relations through procedures that gave voice to broader segments of the population than was typical in medieval political systems. The economic foundation of Novgorod's independence lay in its strategic position controlling access to the fur-producing regions of northern Russia. Novgorodian merchants established trading relationships with indigenous peoples throughout the vast forest territories that stretched from the White Sea to the Ural Mountains, creating commercial networks that could supply international markets with luxury furs while providing manufactured goods and silver currency to populations that had previously operated largely outside the monetary economy. Urban planning in Novgorod reflected both practical commercial needs and cultural preferences inherited from Scandinavian traditions. The city's layout emphasized accessibility to waterways while providing defensive capabilities that could protect valuable commercial assets against both political enemies and criminal elements. Residential districts were organized according to craft specializations and ethnic affiliations, creating neighborhoods where merchants, artisans, and laborers from similar backgrounds could maintain cultural traditions while participating in the broader commercial life of the city. Architectural styles in Novgorod synthesized influences from multiple cultural traditions while adapting to local environmental conditions. Church construction combined Byzantine theological requirements with Northern European building techniques, creating distinctive architectural traditions that reflected the city's position at the intersection of different civilizations. Residential and commercial buildings employed local materials and traditional construction methods, while incorporating design elements learned through contact with more southerly urban centers. The development of craft production and specialization in Novgorod created employment opportunities that attracted immigrants from throughout Northern Europe, while generating products that could compete in international markets. Leatherworking, metalsmithing, textile production, and other specialized crafts developed techniques that combined traditional Northern European skills with innovations learned through commercial contacts. The city's craftsmen became renowned throughout medieval Europe for the quality of their products, creating export industries that supplemented the fur trade as sources of commercial wealth. Staraya Ladoga, often considered the first capital of the emerging Russian state, represented a different model of urban development that reflected its origins as a Scandinavian trading post. The city's strategic location at the junction between Lake Ladoga and the Volkhov River made it an inevitable stopping point for expeditions travelling between Scandinavia and the Southern Territories, creating commercial opportunities that supported permanent settlement and urban growth. Archaeological excavations at Staraya Ladoga have revealed the complexity of cultural relationships that characterized early Varangian urban centers. Scandinavian artifacts appear alongside Slavic pottery, Frankish weapons, Byzantine coins, and Islamic silver, testifying to the international character of the city's commercial life. Burial practices reveal similar cultural mixing, with graves containing individuals whose ethnic origins cannot be determined from archaeological evidence alone, suggesting rapid cultural integration among the various populations attracted by commercial opportunities. The evolution of Staraya Ladoga from seasonal trading post to permanent urban centre illustrates the broader processes that transformed the Varangian territories during the height of the silver trade. Temporary structures built to shelter merchants during trading seasons gave way to permanent residences for families whose livelihoods depended on year-round commercial activities. Defensive fortifications evolved from simple palisades to sophisticated stone constructions that could protect valuable accumulated wealth against both external enemies and internal disorder. Smolensk and Chernigov represented additional examples of urban development that reflected the diverse ways in which Varangian communities adapted to the opportunities created by international commerce. Smolensk's position controlling portages between river systems made it a crucial link in the commercial chain connecting Scandinavia to Byzantium, while Chernigov's location provided access to the steppe territories, where nomadic peoples supplied horses, furs, and slaves demanded by southern markets. Urban planning in these developing cities reflected both practical considerations related to commerce and defense, and cultural preferences that varied according to the ethnic composition of their populations. Cities with predominantly Slavic populations often maintained traditional village-like layouts even as they grew to urban size, while settlements with significant Scandinavian populations emphasized defensive positions and centralized market areas that reflected Northern European urban traditions. The cultural and religious exchange facilitated by these commercial networks created intellectual and artistic developments that enriched medieval European civilization, while creating new syntheses that transcended traditional ethnic and religious boundaries. Missionary activities, both Christian and Islamic, followed commercial routes and created opportunities for religious dialogue that influenced theological development throughout the region. The conversion efforts of Byzantine Orthodox missionaries, Western European Catholic clergy, and Islamic scholars created competitive religious environments that enhanced intellectual sophistication while creating new sources of political tension. Artistic influences flowed along commercial routes in both directions, creating synthetic artistic traditions that combined elements from multiple cultural sources. Scandinavian metalworking techniques influenced by Islamic decorative traditions produced jewellery and weapons that were prized throughout medieval Europe. Byzantine artistic motifs adapted to Northern European preferences appeared in religious art that served newly converted Christian populations, while maintaining connections to traditional cultural expressions. Architectural styles developed during this period reflected the international character of Varangian urban centres, while adapting to local environmental conditions and cultural preferences. Church architecture combined Byzantine theological requirements with Northern European construction techniques and decorative traditions, creating distinctive regional styles that influenced religious building throughout Eastern Europe for centuries. Secular architecture similarly synthesized functional requirements with aesthetic preferences drawn from multiple cultural traditions. Literary traditions and chronicle writing flourished in urban centres that possessed the economic resources to support scholarly activities and the cultural diversity that stimulated intellectual development. The primary chronicle and other historical works produced during this period represent sophisticated attempts to understand the complex cultural relationships that characterized Varangian society, while creating narrative frameworks that could accommodate multiple ethnic and religious perspectives. Educational institutions, primarily associated with religious communities, developed curricula that reflected both Christian theological requirements and practical needs related to commercial and administrative activities. Literacy rates in major urban centres probably exceeded those typical in contemporary Western European cities, reflecting both the practical demands of international commerce and cultural traditions that valued learning and intellectual achievement. Music, storytelling, and oral traditions evolved to reflect the cultural complexity of Varangian society, while preserving elements of different ethnic heritages that contributed to the emerging synthetic culture. Traditional Scandinavian saga traditions adapted to include stories about Eastern adventures and cultural encounters, while Slavic folk traditions incorporated elements related to interaction with Scandinavian traders and rulers. Byzantine liturgical music influenced religious practices throughout the region, while coexisting with traditional musical forms that served secular social functions. The role of women in Varangian society during this period of commercial expansion and cultural synthesis reveals aspects of medieval European social organization that challenge many traditional assumptions about gender relationships and economic participation. Female traders and property owners appear frequently in contemporary sources, suggesting that women participated actively in commercial activities and possessed legal rights that exceeded those typical in many contemporary European societies. Archaeological evidence for women's economic activities includes graves containing scales, weights, and commercial implements that suggest direct participation in trading activities rather than simply passive inheritance of commercial wealth. Female graves from this period often contain quantities of silver jewellery and coins that indicate personal wealth accumulation through commercial activities, while the geographic distribution of these discoveries suggests that women travelled extensively as part of trading expeditions. Marriage alliances arranged by prominent women played crucial diplomatic roles in maintaining the political relationships that supported international commerce. Female members of ruling families often possessed the linguistic skills and cultural knowledge necessary for effective diplomatic communication, while their positions as wives and mothers in different political communities created kinship networks that facilitated commercial cooperation across ethnic and political boundaries. Religious patronage by women contributed significantly to the architectural and artistic development that characterized Varangian urban centers during this period. Female donors funded church construction, commissioned religious artworks, and supported monastic communities that served educational and cultural functions, extending far beyond purely religious activities. The involvement of women in religious patronage created opportunities for female participation in cultural development, while providing practical support for institutions that enhanced urban sophistication. Archaeological evidence of women's status in Varangian society includes burial practices that reveal significant variations in female social position, while suggesting general improvement in women's circumstances compared to earlier periods. Elite female graves from the 10th and 11th centuries often contain imported goods, precious metals, and religious artifacts that indicate both personal wealth and high social status, while the presence of distinctively female grave goods suggests recognition of gender-specific social roles and achievements. Comparison with Scandinavian homeland practices reveals both continuities and significant departures in women's roles within Varangian society. Traditional Northern European customs that granted women substantial legal rights and economic independence appear to have been maintained in Varangian territories, while new opportunities created by commercial wealth and cultural contact enhanced women's potential for social and economic achievement. The influence of Christian marriage customs and Byzantine legal traditions created additional complexities in gender relationships, while generally supporting women's legal and economic rights. The prosperity generated by silver trade and international commerce created social conditions that enhanced opportunities for female participation in economic and cultural activities, while maintaining traditional respect for women's contributions to family and community welfare. Women's roles as cultural mediators between different ethnic communities became particularly important in urban centres, where successful social integration required linguistic skills and cultural sensitivity that women often possessed to a greater degree than their male counterparts. The wealth accumulated through the northern silver trade created the economic foundation for cultural achievements that would define medieval Eastern European civilization, while establishing precedents for international commercial relationships that would influence European development for centuries. The urban centres that emerged during this period combined Scandinavian organisational skills with Slavic agricultural productivity and Byzantine cultural sophistication, creating synthetic civilizations that transcended their individual ethnic components, while maintaining connections to their diverse cultural origins. As the 11th century progressed, the commercial networks that had created this unprecedented prosperity began encountering challenges that would ultimately transform their character and reduce their significance for northern European development. Political instability in the Islamic world disrupted silver production and trade routes, while the development of alternative commercial networks reduced the competitive advantages that had made the northern route so profitable. The transformation of Varangian society from warrior-trader culture to Christian principalities created new priorities that emphasized territorial administration over international commerce, setting the stage for the political and cultural changes that would characterize the following centuries. The wealth flowing through Varangian territories from the silver trade and international commerce created unprecedented opportunities for military innovation and territorial expansion, transforming warrior bands that had once relied on seasonal raiding into professional armies capable of challenging the greatest powers of medieval Europe. The same economic prosperity that built stone churches in Novgorod and filled burial mounds with Islamic silver also funded the development of military technologies and tactical innovations that would reshape the political geography of Eastern Europe while establishing new standards for medieval warfare. The evolution of naval warfare and river fighting represented perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Varangian military innovation. The traditional Scandinavian longships that had served admirably for crossing the Baltic Sea and raiding coastal settlements required substantial modification for the very different challenges presented by inland river systems. The shallow drafts and flexible construction that made these vessels suitable for beach landings proved equally valuable for navigating the variable water levels and hidden obstacles that characterized river warfare. But the confined spaces and limited maneuvering room of inland waterways demanded new tactical approaches. Adaptation of longship design for river operations produced vessels that combined the best features of traditional Scandinavian naval architecture, with innovations developed specifically for inland warfare. These modified ships retained the shallow draft essential for negotiating rapids and sandbars, while incorporating design elements that enhanced their effectiveness in the close-quarters combat typical of river engagements. Reinforced prows capable of ramming enemy vessels, elevated platforms for archers, and specialized equipment for portaging around obstacles transformed traditional longships into purpose-built instruments of riverine warfare. The development of siege warfare and fortification techniques reflected the Varangians' adaptation to the different military challenges presented by territorial conquest, as opposed to simple raiding. Traditional Scandinavian warfare had emphasized mobility and shock tactics against opponents who could be defeated through single decisive battles, but the conquest and retention of settled territories required capabilities for reducing fortified positions and defending conquered lands against counterattack. The wealth generated by commercial activities provided resources for developing these new military capabilities, while creating incentives for protecting accumulated assets against rival forces. Fortification techniques developed by Varangian military engineers combined traditional Northern European defensive concepts with innovations learned through contact with Byzantine and Islamic military traditions. The hill forts that protected many Varangian settlements employed earthwork and timber construction methods inherited from Scandinavian traditions, while incorporating stone masonry techniques and architectural principles derived from more advanced military engineering practices encountered through commercial and diplomatic contacts. The integration of land and sea operations became a hallmark of Varangian military strategy, reflecting both their naval traditions and the geographic realities of territories that depended on river transportation for communication and supply. Combined operations that coordinated riverine naval forces with overland military movements provided tactical advantages that proved decisive in numerous campaigns against opponents who lacked similar capabilities for amphibious warfare. The logistics of supplying river campaigns presented unique challenges that required innovations in military organization and supply management. Traditional Scandinavian raiding expeditions had relied on foraging and plunder for sustenance, but extended campaigns in territories where local populations might be hostile or insufficient to support large military forces required systematic approaches to supply and provisioning. The development of supply bases along major river routes, coordinated with naval transport capabilities, created logistical systems that could support military operations far from traditional bases of support. Weather and seasonal considerations played crucial roles in the planning and execution of river campaigns, creating constraints that influence both tactical decision-making and strategic planning. Spring campaigns could take advantage of high water levels that facilitated navigation, while providing concealment for military movements, but risked encountering enemies who had spent winter months preparing defensive positions. Summer operations offered optimal weather conditions but required careful water management, as falling river levels could strand naval forces far from friendly territory. The evolution of land warfare throughout Varangian territories reflected both the influence of wealth generated through commercial activities and the military challenges presented by governing settled populations while defending against nomadic raiders from the steppes. The adoption of heavy cavalry techniques learned from steppe peoples represented one of the most significant innovations in Varangian military organization, transforming armies that had previously relied primarily on infantry tactics into combined arms forces capable of meeting mounted opponents on equal terms. Heavy cavalry adoption required substantial changes in military equipment, training, and tactical doctrine that reflected the economic prosperity that made such expensive military innovations possible. The costs associated with maintaining war horses, specialized weapons, and heavy armor exceeded the resources available to most traditional warrior societies, but the wealth generated through international trade provided Varangian rulers with the economic foundation necessary for developing professional cavalry forces that could compete with the mounted armies of steppe nomads and Byzantine themes. The integration of cavalry tactics with traditional Scandinavian infantry methods created combined arms approaches that maximized the advantages of both types of forces while minimizing their individual weaknesses. Infantry formations provided the tactical stability and defensive strength that had characterized Northern European warfare for centuries, while cavalry units provided the mobility and shock action necessary for exploiting tactical opportunities and pursuing defeated enemies. The coordination between different types of military forces required command and control innovations that enhanced overall military effectiveness. Infantry tactics and weapon development evolved to complement cavalry innovations while maintaining the combat effectiveness that had made Scandinavian warriors feared throughout medieval Europe. Traditional weapons like the battle axe and long spear were refined through improved metallurgy and enhanced designs that increased their effectiveness against both mounted and dismounted opponents. The development of specialized anti-cavalry weapons reflected the practical experience gained through conflicts with steppe nomads, whose military traditions emphasized mounted warfare. Weapon development during this period benefited from both the technical skills of Scandinavian metalworkers and exposure to advanced military technologies encountered through commercial and diplomatic contacts. Islamic metallurgy techniques, transmitted through trading relationships, enhanced the quality of steel produced in Varangian territories, while Byzantine military engineers provided knowledge of advanced siege weapons and fortification methods. The synthesis of different technological traditions created weapon systems that combined the best features of multiple military cultures. Castle building and siege technologies represented areas where Varangian military innovation drew heavily on external influences, while adapting foreign techniques to local conditions and strategic requirements. The stone fortifications that began appearing throughout Varangian territories during the 10th and 11th centuries reflected architectural principles derived from Byzantine and Western European models, but incorporated design elements that addressed the specific threats and opportunities presented by Eastern European geography and climate. Military organization and command structures evolved to accommodate the increasing complexity and scale of Varangian military operations while maintaining the personal loyalty relationships that had provided the foundation for traditional Northern European warrior societies. Professional military forces required systematic approaches to recruitment, training, and compensation that differed significantly from the seasonal warrior bands that had characterized earlier Scandinavian expansion. But successful innovation required preserving the morale and unit cohesion that made Northern European warriors particularly effective in combat. The development of military hierarchies that could coordinate different types of forces while maintaining effective command and control over extended campaigns required organizational innovations that drew on both traditional Scandinavian leadership methods and administrative techniques learned through contact with more sophisticated military systems. The result was hybrid command structures that combined personal charisma and individual combat leadership with systematic military planning and logistical coordination. Integration with Slavic and steppe allies created both opportunities and challenges for Varangian military development. Allied forces provided local knowledge, specialized capabilities, and additional manpower that enhanced overall military effectiveness, but also required diplomatic skills and cultural sensitivity that complemented traditional military virtues. The management of multi-ethnic military coalitions became a crucial skill for Varangian commanders, who needed to maintain unity and morale among forces drawn from different cultural backgrounds with varying military traditions and political objectives. The major military campaigns undertaken by Varangian forces during this period demonstrated both their enhanced military capabilities and the strategic ambitions that commercial prosperity had made possible. The series of attacks on Constantinople represent perhaps the most spectacular examples of Varangian military innovation, as these expeditions required unprecedented coordination between naval and land forces operating at distances far from traditional bases of support. The attack of 860, traditionally attributed to Askald and Deir, marked the first occasion when Scandinavian forces demonstrated the capability for threatening the Byzantine capital itself. Contemporary Byzantine sources describe the psychological shock created by the sudden appearance of a northern fleet before the walls of Constantinople, suggesting that the military capabilities demonstrated exceeded anything that Byzantine planners had anticipated from barbarian forces. The expedition's ability to withdraw safely after extracting tribute and commercial concessions established precedents for the larger and more sophisticated campaigns that would follow. Oleg's campaign of 907, culminating in his legendary hanging of a shield on Constantinople's gates, represented a significant escalation in both the scale and sophistication of Varangian military operations. The force that appeared before Constantinople apparently included not only Scandinavian warriors, but also Slavic allies, and specialized siege equipment that suggested systematic military planning rather than opportunistic raiding. The favorable treaty terms negotiated following this expedition provided economic benefits that justified the enormous costs associated with mounting such ambitious military operations. The expedition of 941, led by Igor, demonstrated both the continued attractiveness of Byzantine targets and the challenges associated with operations at such extended distances from Varangian home bases. Contemporary sources describe Greek fire attacks that inflicted significant casualties on Varangian naval forces, suggesting that Byzantine military technology had evolved to meet the challenges presented by northern attackers. The expedition's mixed results illustrated the risks associated with ambitious military operations, while confirming the continued viability of such campaigns under favorable circumstances. The final major attack on Constantinople in 1043 occurred under very different political and military circumstances than the earlier expeditions. By this time, Varangian military forces were operating as allies of the Byzantine Empire in many contexts, while the political objectives of Kievan rulers had evolved beyond simple wealth acquisition to include complex diplomatic and dynastic considerations. The campaign's failure marked the end of the era when direct military assault on Constantinople remained a viable option for northern forces. Caspian Sea expeditions and raids represented a different category of military operation that demonstrated Varangian capabilities for extended campaigns in unfamiliar territories, while illustrating the geographic scope of their military ambitions. These expeditions, which required portaging vessels between river systems and operating in desert and mountain environments, very different from traditional northern European settings, showcased the adaptability and logistical sophistication that Varangian military organization had achieved. The challenges associated with Caspian expeditions included not only the geographic obstacles involved in reaching these distant waters, but also the military opposition provided by local rulers who possessed their own sophisticated military traditions and defensive capabilities. The mixed results achieved by these expeditions reflected both the enormous difficulties associated with such ambitious operations and the impressive military capabilities that made them possible at all. Conflicts with the Khazar Khaganate represented sustained military campaigns against opponents whose military capabilities and political organization rivaled those of the Varangians themselves. The Khazars controlled crucial trade routes and commercial centers that directly competed with Varangian commercial interests, creating economic incentives for military action that complemented traditional motivations related to territorial expansion and wealth acquisition. The military techniques employed in anti-Khazar campaigns required adaptation to steppe warfare conditions that differed significantly from the forest and river environments where Varangian forces had developed their tactical traditions. Success against mounted nomadic opponents required enhanced mobility, specialized anti-cavalry tactics, and logistical capabilities that could support extended operations in territories with limited agricultural resources and dispersed populations. The ultimate success of campaigns against the Khazar Khaganate marked a significant turning point in the political geography of Eastern Europe, while demonstrating the military effectiveness of evolved Varangian tactical and organizational methods. The elimination of Khazar competition enhanced Varangian control over eastern trade routes, while removing a political and military rival that had constrained territorial expansion for generations. Wars with Pecheneg and Cuman nomads represented ongoing military challenges that required constant attention and resource allocation throughout the height of Varangian political power. These conflicts differed from campaigns against settled opponents in requiring defensive strategies that could protect agricultural populations and commercial assets against highly mobile raiding forces whose military traditions emphasized speed and surprise rather than sustained territorial conquest. The development of defensive systems capable of protecting settled populations against nomadic raiders required innovations in military organization that combined professional military forces with local militia systems while maintaining the mobility necessary for pursuing raiding forces into steppe territories. The construction of frontier fortifications and the organization of rapid response forces created defensive capabilities that could minimize the damage inflicted by nomadic raids while providing bases for retaliatory expeditions. Internal succession wars and their impact on military development created both challenges and opportunities for Varangian political and military evolution. Dynastic conflicts that pitted members of ruling families against each other required military innovations that could provide advantages in civil warfare while maintaining the capabilities necessary for defending against external enemies. The military technologies and organizational methods developed during civil conflicts often found application in subsequent campaigns against foreign opponents. The impact of succession wars on military development extended beyond immediate tactical innovations to include long-term changes in military organization and political control that influenced the evolution of Varangian statecraft. Professional military forces that had been developed to support particular claimants often retained their organizational structure and institutional loyalties after conflicts had been resolved, creating military institutions that possessed independent political influence and could constrain the authority of future rulers. The cumulative effect of these military innovations and campaigns was the transformation of Varangian society from a collection of warrior bands pursuing individual advancement to a sophisticated military culture capable of sustained territorial conquest and defense. The wealth generated through commercial activities had provided the economic foundation for military developments that enhanced political power while creating new strategic opportunities and challenges that would define the subsequent evolution of Eastern European civilization. Military innovation during this period reflected both the creative adaptation of traditional Northern European martial traditions to new strategic environments and the systematic incorporation of military technologies and organizational methods learned through contact with more advanced civilizations. The synthetic military culture that emerged combined the individual combat effectiveness and unit cohesion that had characterized Scandinavian warrior traditions with the strategic planning and logistical sophistication necessary for governing territorial states and conducting extended military campaigns. The legacy of Varangian military innovation extended far beyond the immediate political and territorial gains achieved through successful campaigns. The military technologies, tactical methods, and organizational innovations developed during this period influenced military development throughout Eastern Europe for centuries, while creating institutional precedents that shaped the political evolution of emerging medieval kingdoms. The transformation of Varangian military culture from raiding bands to professional armies paralleled similar developments throughout medieval Europe, while contributing distinctive elements that reflected the unique geographic and cultural circumstances of Eastern European development. The military innovations and territorial conquests that had elevated Varangian rulers to prominence throughout Eastern Europe during the 10th and 11th centuries created the very conditions that would ultimately undermine their distinctive identity and political cohesion. The success that had transformed seasonal raiders into the founders of principalities stretching from Novgorod to Kiev generated internal pressures and external challenges that proved more destructive than any enemy army had ever managed to achieve. As the 12th century dawned, the sons and grandsons of warriors who had carved their names into the gates of Constantinople found themselves governing territories so vast, populations so diverse, and political structures so complex that the personal loyalties and cultural traditions that had originally unified Varangian society could no longer contain the centrifugal forces pulling their world apart. The fragmentation of the Kievan state began not with external conquest or military defeat, but with the internal logic of succession practices that had served earlier generations well, but proved inadequate for governing a territorial empire spanning multiple ethnic groups and economic regions. The system of lateral succession that distributed political authority among different branches of the ruling dynasty had originally provided flexibility and prevented the concentration of power in ways that might threaten traditional concepts of shared leadership among warrior elites. However, as the dynasty proliferated and territories expanded, this system created competing claims to authority that could only be resolved through civil warfare. Succession crises during the 12th century revealed the fundamental contradiction between traditional Scandinavian concepts of shared leadership among related warriors and the administrative requirements of governing settled populations across vast distances. Each generation of rulers produced multiple sons who possessed legitimate claims to portions of their father's territories, but the practical division of political authority among numerous claimants created administrative chaos and military weakness that invited both internal rebellion and external attack. The civil wars that erupted following the death of major rulers consumed resources that had previously supported military expansion and economic development, while creating opportunities for regional leaders to assert independence from central authority. Local nobles who had originally served as appointed administrators for distant princes began treating their territories as hereditary possessions, establishing their own diplomatic relationships and military forces that gradually reduced the practical authority of nominal overlords in Kiev or other major centres. The rise of regional principalities reflected both the practical impossibility of governing vast territories from single administrative centres and the emergence of local identities that transcended the ethnic distinctions that had originally defined political relationships. Princes ruling territories around Novgorod, Smolensk, Chernigov, and other centres began pursuing policies that reflected local interests and conditions, rather than broader dynastic or ethnic considerations, creating political fragmentation that made coordinated responses to external challenges increasingly difficult. Regional economic specialization that had originally enhanced the overall prosperity of Varangian territories began creating divergent political interests that undermined political unity. Northern territories that depended heavily on fur trading maintained different priorities from southern regions that emphasized agricultural production and steppe trade. Urban centers that had grown wealthy through international commerce developed political interests that conflicted with rural areas that provided agricultural resources and military manpower. These economic differences created the foundation for political conflicts that could not be resolved through traditional methods of personal negotiation among warrior elites. Changing trade routes and economic decline during the 12th and 13th centuries undermined the commercial foundations that had originally supported Varangian political expansion and cultural development. The disruption of Islamic silver supplies due to political instability in Central Asia reduced the monetary resources that had facilitated international commerce, while the development of alternative trading networks diminished the competitive advantages that had made the eastern river routes so profitable for northern European merchants. The decline in silver availability forced fundamental adjustments in economic relationships throughout Varangian territories. Commercial activities that had depended on abundant silver currency had to adapt to barter systems and local monetary substitutes that reduced the efficiency of long-distance trade while limiting the accumulation of portable wealth that had previously supported military expeditions and urban development. The reduced flow of silver wealth affected not only merchants and rulers, but also craftsmen, farmers, and labourers whose prosperity had depended indirectly on the commercial networks that had transformed Eastern European economic life. Environmental challenges and climate change during this period created additional pressures that complicated the political and economic difficulties facing Varangian rulers. The medieval warm period that had supported agricultural expansion and population growth during the 9th through 11th centuries began giving way to cooler and more variable weather patterns that reduced agricultural productivity while increasing the frequency of crop failures and famines that stressed the social fabric of settled communities. Climate change affected different regions unequally, creating disparities in agricultural productivity and population carrying capacity that exacerbated political tensions between different principalities. Northern territories that had always faced marginal growing conditions became even less productive, while southern regions maintained better agricultural output that made them more attractive targets for both political control and nomadic raiding. These environmental pressures contributed to population movements and political conflicts that further destabilized the fragmented political landscape. The Mongol invasion and its aftermath represented the culmination of internal weaknesses and external pressures that had been building throughout the 12th and early 13th centuries. The arrival of Mongol forces in Eastern Europe during the 1230s found Varangian principalities divided among themselves, economically weakened by declining trade revenues, and militarily unprepared for the scale and sophistication of the threat they faced. The political fragmentation that had developed over the previous century made coordinated resistance impossible, while the military innovations that had once given Varangian forces advantages over their opponents proved inadequate against enemies who possessed superior organizational skills and tactical mobility. The psychological impact of Mongol conquest extended far beyond the immediate military and political consequences. The descendants of warriors who had once terrorized Constantinople and extracted tribute from Byzantine emperors found themselves reduced to tributary status under foreign overlords whose cultural traditions and political methods bore no resemblance to anything in their historical experience. The transformation from independent rulers to subordinate princes fundamentally altered the political culture of Varangian territories, while creating new constraints on cultural development and economic activity. Mongol administrative methods that divided conquered territories according to strategic and economic considerations rather than traditional ethnic or political boundaries further fragmented the remnants of Varangian political unity. The systematic destruction of urban centres that had served as focal points for cultural development eliminated much of the infrastructure that had supported the literary and artistic achievements of the previous centuries, while the deportation of skilled craftsmen and administrators disrupted the transmission of cultural knowledge and technical skills. The end of the eastern trade route as a major commercial highway reflected both the direct effects of Mongol conquest and broader changes in international commerce that reduced the significance of the river networks that had originally enabled Varangian expansion. Constantinople's decline as a trade destination resulted from the Byzantine Empire's territorial losses and economic weaknesses that made it a less attractive commercial partner, while the development of alternative trade routes reduced the competitive advantages that had made the Dnieper and Volga systems so important for international commerce. The decline of Constantinople as the ultimate destination for northern merchants eliminated much of the economic incentive that had originally motivated Scandinavian expansion into Eastern Europe. The city that had once represented unlimited wealth and exotic luxury became increasingly isolated from international trade networks, while its capacity to absorb northern products like furs and amber diminished along with its overall economic vitality. The reduction in Byzantine demand for northern products created ripple effects throughout the trading networks that had supported Varangian commercial activities for centuries. Alternative trade networks that developed during this period shifted commercial activity toward routes that bypassed the traditional river highways controlled by Varangian princes. Italian merchants developing direct commercial relationships with Asian suppliers reduced European dependence on the overland routes that had connected northern Europe to Mediterranean markets, while the expansion of Hanseatic League activities in the Baltic created new commercial opportunities that offered alternatives to the Eastern River trade. Political instability in the Byzantine Empire during the 12th and 13th centuries, culminating in the Fourth Crusade's capture of Constantinople in 1204, disrupted the diplomatic and commercial relationships that had provided political benefits for Varangian rulers beyond simple economic gains. The fragmentation of the Byzantine Empire into competing successor states eliminated the unified imperial authority that had served as diplomatic partner for Varangian princes, while the establishment of Western European political control over former Byzantine territories created new complications for maintaining traditional commercial relationships. Changes in Scandinavian homeland priorities during this same period reduced the pool of potential recruits for Varangian military and commercial activities, while eliminating much of the cultural connection that had maintained identity links between Eastern European Varangian communities and their Northern European origins. The development of more centralized kingdoms in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden created local opportunities for military service and social advancement that competed directly with the attractions of distant service in Eastern Europe. The emergence of powerful royal authorities in Scandinavian kingdoms that could provide military leadership, economic opportunities, and social advancement for ambitious young men eliminated many of the push factors that had originally motivated Scandinavian expansion eastward. The consolidation of political power under strong monarchs created domestic alternatives to foreign military service, while the increasing sophistication of Scandinavian society reduced the relative attractiveness of the wealth and cultural opportunities available in Eastern European territories. The last generation of active Varangians who maintained meaningful connections to their Scandinavian origins represented individuals caught between worlds that were rapidly growing apart. These men, born in Eastern European territories to families whose Scandinavian ancestry was becoming increasingly remote, found themselves culturally isolated from both their ancestral homeland and their immediate surroundings as linguistic, religious, and political changes accelerated the pace of cultural assimilation. Archaeological evidence from this transitional period reveals the poignant details of cultural transformation at the personal level. Burial practices that had once clearly distinguished Scandinavian graves from those of local populations became increasingly ambiguous, with grave goods that combined traditional Northern European elements with local cultural markers in ways that suggest uncertain or multiple cultural identities. The disappearance of runic inscriptions from personal objects and memorial stones marked the end of literacy in Old Norse, while the appearance of Cyrillic and Latin inscriptions indicated the adoption of writing systems associated with different cultural and religious traditions. Cultural assimilation during the 13th and 14th centuries completed the transformation that had been developing gradually for several generations. The linguistic Slavicization of Varangian families progressed from bilingualism to monolingual adoption of local languages, with Old Norse surviving only in personal names and specialized vocabulary related to military and commercial activities that retained historical significance. Family names that had once clearly indicated Scandinavian ancestry became increasingly Slavicized in their forms and pronunciation, while marriage patterns that had previously maintained some distinction between Scandinavian and local populations became completely integrated. The complete Christianization of formerly Varangian territories eliminated the last vestiges of pagan religious practices that had maintained connections to pre-Christian Scandinavian cultural traditions. The construction of stone churches in architectural styles that synthesized Byzantine theological requirements with local building traditions created religious environments that bore no resemblance to the pagan temples and sacred groves that had served earlier generations. Religious festivals and ceremonial practices adopted Orthodox Christian forms that replaced traditional Scandinavian seasonal celebrations and ritual activities. Yet the preservation of Scandinavian elements in local culture occurred through subtle processes that maintained historical memory while adapting it to changed circumstances. Legal traditions that emphasized personal honor and individual responsibility retained elements of Scandinavian customary law, even after formal legal codes had adopted Slavic and Byzantine principles. Military traditions that valued personal courage and loyalty to commanders preserved aspects of warrior culture, even after military organization had adapted to different tactical and strategic requirements. Architectural elements in church construction and residential building occasionally reflected Northern European design preferences that had been adapted to local materials and climatic conditions. Decorative arts, particularly metalwork and wood carving, sometimes incorporated stylistic elements that derived from Scandinavian artistic traditions, while serving contemporary religious and secular functions. These cultural survivals, often invisible to casual observation, represented the complex processes through which historical memory was preserved within transformed cultural contexts. The creation of founding myths and legendary accounts during the later medieval period reflected both the desire to maintain connections to distinguished ancestral traditions and the need to legitimize contemporary political arrangements through historical narrative. The stories that grew up around figures like Rurik and his successors combined historical memories with literary conventions that served the political and cultural needs of later generations, rather than providing accurate historical accounts. These legendary narratives served multiple functions for communities that had lost direct cultural connections to their Scandinavian origins, but retained political and social benefits from claiming such ancestry. Ruling families used these stories to legitimize their authority over ethnically diverse populations, while local communities employed them to maintain distinctive identities that distinguished them from neighboring groups with different historical traditions. The literary elaboration of these foundational narratives created cultural monuments that replaced the physical artifacts and institutional practices that had originally maintained Scandinavian cultural identity. Archaeological evidence of cultural transformation reveals the complexity of identity change at the material level. Personal objects that had once clearly indicated ethnic identity became increasingly ambiguous as cultural synthesis progressed, with grave goods that combined elements from multiple traditions in ways that suggest complex individual identities rather than simple ethnic categories. Settlement patterns evolved from the defensive positions favoured by early Scandinavian communities to village and urban layouts that reflected local agricultural and commercial priorities. Building techniques that had originally distinguished Scandinavian construction methods from local practices gradually converged as practical considerations and available materials imposed common solutions to architectural challenges. The disappearance of distinctively Scandinavian building elements from domestic and public architecture marked the completion of cultural adaptation while preserving functional approaches to construction that had proven effective in local conditions. Religious artifacts from this period reveal the complexity of theological and cultural synthesis that accompanied Christianization. Personal devotional objects sometimes combined Christian religious symbols with decorative elements that derived from traditional Northern European artistic traditions, creating hybrid forms that reflected the gradual nature of cultural transformation. Church furnishings and religious vestments occasionally incorporated materials and techniques that maintained connections to pre-Christian craft traditions while serving Christian liturgical functions. The cumulative effect of these cultural changes was the emergence of distinctive regional identities that combined elements from multiple ethnic traditions, while creating new synthetic cultures that reflected the specific historical experiences of local communities. The descendants of Scandinavian settlers became indistinguishable from their neighbours in linguistic, religious and cultural terms, but retained historical memories and institutional traditions that influenced their political development and cultural expression for centuries. By the 14th century, the transformation of Varangian society was essentially complete. The river routes that had once carried Viking warriors toward Byzantine gold had become commercial highways serving merchants whose ethnic origins were irrelevant to their economic activities. The cities that had been founded as Scandinavian trading posts had evolved into regional centres, whose political and cultural life reflected centuries of cultural synthesis. The princes who ruled these territories bore Scandinavian names but thought in Slavic languages and governed according to political traditions that synthesized multiple cultural influences. The decline and transformation of Varangian civilization represented not a failure, but a successful adaptation to changing historical circumstances. The flexibility that had enabled Scandinavian warriors and traders to establish themselves in foreign territories ultimately facilitated their integration into the emerging medieval European political and cultural order. Their legacy survived not in preserved ethnic enclaves, but in the political institutions, cultural traditions and historical memories that influenced Eastern European development for centuries to come. The cultural transformation that had erased the last visible traces of Varangian identity from Eastern European society by the 14th century also buried the physical evidence of their remarkable journey beneath centuries of accumulated soil, forgotten beneath the foundations of later buildings, and scattered across museum collections whose curators had no understanding of their true significance. For generations, the story of the Varangians survived only in chronicles written by medieval monks, whose literary purposes often overwhelmed their historical accuracy, creating legendary accounts that scholars dismissed as fantasy, while the real evidence of Scandinavian expansion lay hidden in burial mounds that farmers ploughed over and riverbanks that erosion slowly revealed. The resurrection of Varangian history began not in libraries or lecture halls, but in the muddy excavations where archaeologists uncovered artifacts that medieval chroniclers never mentioned, in the laboratory analyses that revealed the chemical signatures of distant silver mines, and in the genetic studies that traced the movement of peoples across continents with precision that no written source could provide. Modern scientific archaeology has transformed our understanding of the Varangians from a collection of half-legendary figures into a complex civilization whose material remains tell stories of cultural adaptation, economic innovation, and political achievement that chronicle accounts could barely imagine. The excavations at Staraya Ladoga, beginning in the early 20th century and continuing through sophisticated modern investigations, have revealed layer after layer of evidence that documents the transformation of a seasonal trading post into one of medieval Europe's most important commercial centres. The site's stratigraphy reads like a book whose pages chronicle the gradual evolution of Varangian society, from its earliest Scandinavian origins through its ultimate integration into Slavic civilization, with each archaeological level containing artifacts that illuminate different phases of this remarkable cultural journey. The earliest levels at Staraya Ladoga contain unmistakably Scandinavian artifacts. Distinctive oval brooches that could have been worn by women in Norway or Denmark, weapons whose metallurgy and decoration reflect Northern European craft traditions, and pottery whose forms and firing techniques parallel those found in contemporary Swedish settlements. These earliest deposits, dating to the 8th and 9th centuries, provide tangible evidence for the Scandinavian origins of the settlement, while revealing the material culture that the first Varangian traders brought with them into the Slavic territories. As the stratigraphy ascends through successive centuries, the artifacts reveal the complex process of cultural synthesis that transformed both the settlers and their material culture. Scandinavian metalwork begins incorporating decorative motifs derived from Slavic and Byzantine traditions, while local pottery appears in forms that suggest technological exchange between different ethnic communities. The appearance of Islamic silver coins in increasingly large quantities documents the growth of international trading relationships, while the gradual changes in burial practices visible in the site's cemeteries reveal the religious and cultural transformations that accompanied political and economic development. The workshop areas excavated at Staraya Ladoga provide unprecedented insights into the craft production that supported both local needs and international commerce. Evidence of specialized metalworking, including the production of weapons, jewelry, and trading implements, reveals technological innovations that combined Scandinavian smithing traditions with techniques learned through commercial contacts extending from Byzantium to Central Asia. Boneworking shops produced combs, gaming pieces, and decorative objects whose styles evolved to reflect changing cultural preferences, while textile production areas contain evidence of weaving techniques that incorporated both Northern European traditions and exotic materials acquired through long-distance trade. Gnezdovo, the great trading centre near modern Smolensk, has yielded archaeological evidence that surpasses even Staraya Ladoga in demonstrating the scale and sophistication of Varangian commercial activities. The site's extensive burial grounds contain over 3,000 mounds that represent one of medieval Europe's largest and most informative cemetery complexes, with graves that document not only the wealth accumulated through international trade, but also the cultural diversity that characterize major Varangian commercial centres. The burial practices revealed at Gnezdovo illustrate the complex ethnic relationships that developed in Varangian trading communities. Some graves contain individuals buried according to distinctively Scandinavian customs, with weapons, jewellery, and personal possessions that reflect Northern European cultural traditions. Other burials follow Slavic practices, with grave goods and burial orientations that suggest local cultural affiliations. Most remarkably, many graves combine elements from multiple traditions, containing individuals whose cultural identities appear to have transcended simple ethnic categories. The wealth revealed in Gnezdovo's burial grounds provides concrete evidence for the prosperity generated by international commerce during the height of Varangian expansion. Individual graves contain quantities of silver that would have represented enormous wealth by medieval standards, including not only Islamic coins but also silver jewellery, decorative objects, and ingots that testify to the accumulation of precious metals on an unprecedented scale. The geographic origins of grave goods extend from Scandinavia to Byzantium and from Western Europe to Central Asia, documenting commercial relationships that connected Northern Europe to trading networks spanning much of the known world. The residential and commercial areas excavated at Gnezdovo reveal urban planning and architectural traditions that synthesized influences from multiple cultural sources while adapting to local environmental conditions. Building techniques combined Scandinavian construction methods with local adaptations that reflected both available materials and climatic requirements, while the organization of residential districts appears to have accommodated ethnic diversity through neighborhood arrangements that allowed different cultural groups to maintain their traditions while participating in shared commercial activities. Shestavica and other burial grounds throughout the former Varangian territories have contributed additional pieces to the archaeological puzzle that reconstructs Varangian society and culture. Each site provides unique insights into regional variations in cultural development, economic specialization, and political organization that reveal the diversity concealed within the broad historical category of Varangian expansion. The cemetery at Shestavica, located near Chernigov, contains burials that document the cultural synthesis that occurred in territories where Scandinavian settlers encountered populations that had already been influenced by Byzantine cultural and religious traditions. The grave goods recovered from Szestowice include religious artifacts that reveal the complex religious transformations that accompanied Varangian expansion. Christian crosses appear alongside traditional Scandinavian religious symbols, while Byzantine religious objects are found in graves that also contain distinctively Northern European weapons and personal ornaments. These religious artifacts document the gradual conversion process that transformed pagan Scandinavian communities into Christian principalities while preserving elements of traditional cultural identity. Archaeological investigations in Constantinople itself have revealed evidence of Varangian presence that confirms and amplifies the historical accounts of the Varangian Guard's service to Byzantine emperors. Excavations in the palace district have uncovered weapons, personal ornaments, and other artifacts that can be attributed to Northern European warriors, while graffiti carved into the walls of Hagia Sophia include runic inscriptions that provide direct evidence of Scandinavian presence in the imperial capital. The runic inscriptions discovered in Constantinople represent some of the most poignant evidence of individual Varangian experiences that archaeological investigation has revealed. These brief texts, carved by homesick warriors into the marble columns of Christianity's greatest cathedral, preserve personal names and simple messages that humanize the historical abstractions found in chronicle accounts. The inscriptions document not only the presence of Scandinavian warriors in Byzantine service, but also their maintenance of literacy in Old Norse and their desire to preserve connections to their Northern European heritage. Artifacts recovered from Byzantine contexts that can be attributed to Varangian Guard members include weapons whose metallurgy and decoration reflect Scandinavian craft traditions, personal ornaments that combine Northern European designs with Byzantine materials, and religious objects that document the complex religious identities that developed among Scandinavians serving Christian emperors while maintaining connections to their pagan origins. The connections between archaeological sites in Eastern Europe and contemporary discoveries in Scandinavian homelands provide crucial evidence for understanding the broader context of Varangian expansion and its impact on both the territories they settled and the communities they left behind. Comparative studies of material culture reveal the technological and artistic exchanges that flowed in both directions along the river routes, with innovations developed in Eastern European contexts appearing in Scandinavian sites, while traditional Northern European craft techniques continued to influence production in Varangian settlements. Numismatic evidence has provided perhaps the most precise and quantifiable data about Varangian commercial activities and their broader economic significance. The distribution patterns of Islamic silver coins throughout Northern Europe document the geographic extent and chronological development of the trading networks that connected the Baltic region to the Islamic world, while the quantities of silver involved reveal the extraordinary scale of wealth transfer that characterized medieval international commerce. Silver coin distributions discovered through archaeological investigation demonstrate the systematic nature of Varangian trading activities, while revealing regional variations in commercial specialization and economic development. Hoards discovered in Sweden often contain thousands of Islamic silver coins, representing decades of accumulated wealth, while similar discoveries in Norway and Denmark document the participation of different Scandinavian regions in Eastern trade. The geographic distribution of these hoards reveals the inland penetration of silver wealth through tributary and kinship relationships that extended commercial benefits far beyond the immediate participants in long-distance trading expeditions. Dating and provenance studies of individual coins have enabled archaeologists to reconstruct the chronological development of trading relationships with unprecedented precision. Chemical analysis of silver content can identify the specific mines where individual coins were produced, while stylistic analysis of coin designs documents the political and administrative changes that occurred in the Islamic world during the period of most intensive northern trade. The combination of these analytical techniques has revealed the complex logistics of medieval international commerce, while documenting the political and economic factors that influenced the availability and movement of precious metals. Economic interpretations of coin hoards have revolutionized understanding of medieval European monetary systems and commercial relationships. The quantities of silver involved in the northern trade represented a significant proportion of total medieval European precious metal supplies, with implications for economic development, political relationships, and cultural change that extended far beyond the immediate participants in Eastern commerce. The economic impact of this silver influx influenced political development throughout Northern Europe, while creating the monetary foundation for urban development and territorial expansion that characterized the High Middle Ages. Comparisons with Western Viking finds have revealed important distinctions between different aspects of Scandinavian expansion that help explain the different historical outcomes achieved in Eastern and Western territories. While Western Viking activities emphasized raiding and temporary occupation that produced relatively limited cultural exchange, Eastern expansion involved permanent settlement and cultural integration that created lasting political and social institutions. The archaeological evidence for these different patterns of expansion appears in contrasting artifact distributions, settlement types, and cultural synthesis patterns that reflect different strategies for interaction with indigenous populations. Modern scientific analysis techniques have enhanced the precision and reliability of archaeological interpretation, while revealing information that was previously inaccessible to historical investigation. Radiocarbon dating has provided absolute chronologies that can be correlated with historical events, while metallurgical analysis has traced the geographic origins of weapons, coins, and ornaments with precision that exceeds any contemporary written documentation. DNA analysis of preserved organic materials has begun revealing information about trade goods, agricultural practices, and technological innovations that chronicle accounts never mentioned. Genetic and linguistic studies have provided revolutionary insights into the demographic and cultural aspects of Varangian expansion that archaeological and historical evidence could only suggest. DNA evidence for Scandinavian migration has confirmed the biological reality of population movement, while revealing the complexity of cultural integration that occurred as Scandinavian settlers established themselves in Eastern European territories. The genetic signatures of modern Eastern European populations preserve evidence of medieval demographic changes with precision that no written source could provide. Population genetics and admixture studies have revealed the extent to which Varangian expansion involved not just male warriors and traders, but also women and entire family groups seeking permanent settlement in new territories. The presence of Scandinavian maternal lineages in modern Eastern European populations documents the participation of women in migration processes, while providing evidence for the establishment of Scandinavian communities that maintained their cultural identity through intermarriage with local populations over multiple generations. The patterns of genetic admixture revealed through modern scientific analysis correspond closely to the archaeological evidence for cultural synthesis, with the strongest Scandinavian genetic signatures appearing in regions along the major river routes, where archaeological evidence documents the heaviest concentration of Scandinavian settlement. The correlation between genetic and archaeological evidence provides powerful confirmation for historical interpretations, while revealing details of demographic change that neither type of evidence could demonstrate independently. Linguistic borrowings and place names have provided additional evidence for the extent and duration of Scandinavian cultural influence in Eastern European territories. Slavic languages contain hundreds of loanwords from Old Norse, particularly terms related to trade, navigation, political organization, and military activities that reflect the specialized knowledge and institutional innovations that Scandinavian settlers contributed to local cultural development. The survival of these linguistic elements in modern languages testifies to the lasting cultural impact of Varangian expansion, while providing evidence for aspects of medieval life that archaeological investigation cannot easily document. Place name studies have revealed the geographic extent of Scandinavian settlement, while documenting the processes of cultural adaptation and linguistic change that accompanied political integration. Many rivers, settlements, and geographic features throughout Eastern Europe bear names that derive from Old Norse appellations, often in forms that reveal the chronological stages of linguistic adaptation as Scandinavian communities gradually adopted local languages while preserving elements of their original cultural identity. Runestone evidence and inscriptions provide direct testimony of individual experiences and cultural attitudes that humanize the broader historical processes documented through archaeological and genetic analysis. The runic inscriptions discovered throughout the former Varangian territories preserve personal names, commemorative texts, and religious invocations that document the maintenance of Scandinavian literacy and cultural identity even as political and economic integration proceeded. These inscriptions represent the voices of individual Varangians speaking across the centuries about their experiences, achievements, and cultural loyalties. Modern scientific methods in historical research have transformed understanding of the Varangians from legendary figures into complex historical actors whose achievements can be documented, analysed, and understood within broader patterns of medieval European development. The combination of archaeological investigation, scientific analysis, and comparative historical research has revealed the remarkable scope of Varangian achievement, while explaining the processes of cultural change that ultimately integrated their descendants into the emerging medieval European political and cultural order. The cumulative impact of modern archaeological and scientific research has been to restore the Varangians to their proper place in European history as founders of political institutions, creators of commercial networks, and cultural innovators whose achievements influenced medieval European development in ways that chronicle accounts could barely suggest. Their story, reconstructed through centuries of patient archaeological investigation and scientific analysis, reveals the complexity and sophistication of medieval cultural interaction, while documenting the human experiences of individuals and communities who participated in one of history's most remarkable examples of successful cultural adaptation and political innovation. The scientific resurrection of Varangian history through archaeological investigation and modern research methods has created more than academic knowledge. The bones and silver, the runic inscriptions and genetic signatures that emerge from centuries of obscurity have become weapons in contemporary political battles, foundations for national identities, and mirrors in which modern societies examine their own experiences with cultural change and global interconnection. The warriors who once carried their axes from the fjords of Norway to the throne rooms of Byzantium could never have imagined that their descendants would fight over their memory with the same intensity that medieval princes had contested their inheritance, or that their story would provide metaphors for understanding a globalized world that would have seemed like magic to even their most far-travelled ancestors. The emergence of the Varangian question as a central issue in Russian national identity during the 18th and 19th centuries reflected political anxieties that extended far beyond historical scholarship. The discovery that the founders of the Russian state bore Scandinavian names and followed Northern European customs challenged narratives of Slavic cultural independence that had become emotionally essential for Russian intellectuals seeking to establish their nation's credentials as a distinctive civilization capable of competing with Western Europe on equal terms. The debate that erupted between Normanist scholars who accepted the evidence for Scandinavian origins and anti-Normanist historians who rejected or minimized foreign influence became a proxy war for broader questions about Russian cultural identity and political legitimacy. The Normanist position, supported by the weight of archaeological and linguistic evidence, argued that Scandinavian settlers had provided the political organization and military leadership that transformed scattered Slavic tribes into the unified state that eventually became the Russian Empire. This interpretation, however accurate historically, carried political implications that made it unacceptable to intellectuals who viewed cultural borrowing as evidence of national weakness and dependence on foreign models. The anti-Normanist response, which emphasized Slavic cultural achievements while downplaying or denying Scandinavian contributions, reflected nationalist sensibilities that valued cultural purity over historical accuracy. The political dimensions of these scholarly debates intensified during periods when Russian relations with Western Europe were particularly strained, with the Varangian question serving as a battlefield where broader conflicts over modernization, westernization, and cultural identity could be fought using historical arguments. Soviet historians inherited these political pressures, while adding ideological requirements that made Scandinavian contributions to Russian state formation even more problematic, since Marxist historical theory demanded that political development reflect economic and social forces rather than the activities of foreign military elites. The resolution of the Normanist controversy through archaeological evidence that confirmed Scandinavian settlement, while revealing the complexity of cultural integration, provided a model for understanding national development that transcended simple categories of foreign conquest or indigenous evolution. Modern Russian historiography has generally accepted the reality of Varangian contributions, while emphasizing the creative cultural synthesis that produced distinctively Russian political and cultural institutions through the interaction between Scandinavian organizational skills and Slavic social foundations. Ukrainian historical narratives have developed their own distinctive interpretation of the Varangian legacy that emphasizes the role of Kiev as the primary center of Varangian political achievement, while challenging Russian claims to exclusive inheritance of this historical tradition. Ukrainian historians have argued that the Kievan state represented a separate political and cultural entity that provided the foundation for Ukrainian national identity rather than simply serving as a precursor to Russian imperial development. This interpretation has gained political significance as Ukraine has sought to establish historical legitimacy for its independence from Russian influence. The Ukrainian emphasis on Kievan Rus as a specifically Ukrainian rather than generically East Slavic political formation has led to reinterpretation of Varangian contributions that stresses their role in creating political institutions that differed significantly from those that later developed in Muscovite Russia. Ukrainian scholars have emphasized the commercial and urban character of Kievan civilization, arguing that Varangian political traditions contributed to the development of more democratic and commercially oriented political structures that contrasted with the autocratic tendencies that characterized later Russian political development. Archaeological discoveries that reveal the distinctiveness of different regional centers within the former Varangian territories have provided evidence that supports Ukrainian claims for separate historical development while complicating simple narratives of unified Russian origins. The material culture revealed at sites throughout Ukraine demonstrates cultural innovations and political arrangements that differed significantly from contemporary developments in northern Russian territories, suggesting that Varangian influence produced diverse political and cultural outcomes rather than uniform institutional development. Scandinavian historical memory has preserved elements of the Varangian story through saga literature and historical traditions that maintained awareness of Eastern expansion long after direct cultural connections had been severed. The Icelandic sagas that celebrate the achievements of figures like Harald Hardrada in Byzantine service provided Scandinavian audiences with narratives of adventure and achievement that glorified their ancestors' roles in medieval European political development while creating cultural pride in historical accomplishments that exceeded anything achieved by contemporary Scandinavian kingdoms. Modern Scandinavian interest in Varangian history has been stimulated by archaeological discoveries that reveal the scale and sophistication of Eastern expansion, while demonstrating the extent to which Viking Age achievements extended beyond the Western raids that had previously dominated popular historical consciousness. The discovery of Scandinavian artifacts throughout Eastern Europe and the genetic evidence for substantial population movement eastward have created new appreciation for aspects of Viking Age expansion that had been overshadowed by more dramatic accounts of raids on England and France. The integration of Varangian history into broader Scandinavian historical narratives has emphasized themes of exploration, cultural adaptation, and peaceful settlement that contrast with the violence and destruction that characterized Western Viking activities. This interpretation has proved attractive to modern Scandinavian societies seeking historical precedents for international cooperation and cultural exchange, while providing examples of successful integration with different ethnic and religious communities that resonate with contemporary multicultural values. Political uses of Varangian history have extended beyond academic disputes to influence diplomatic relationships, territorial claims, and cultural policies throughout Eastern Europe. Russian political leaders have periodically invoked Varangian history to justify claims for special relationships with Ukraine and other former Soviet territories, arguing that shared historical origins create natural political affinities that transcend contemporary national boundaries. These historical arguments have been countered by Ukrainian and other Eastern European intellectuals who emphasize the diversity of medieval political development and reject claims that historical connections justify contemporary political arrangements. The manipulation of Varangian history for political purposes has created scholarly controversies that extend beyond legitimate academic disagreements to include propaganda activities designed to support particular political positions. The selectivity with which different aspects of Varangian history are emphasized or ignored in various national narratives reveals the extent to which historical scholarship can be subordinated to contemporary political needs, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of medieval history for modern political debates. Academic debates and controversies surrounding Varangian history have contributed to the development of more sophisticated methodological approaches to medieval European history, while revealing the challenges faced by scholars working on topics that carry contemporary political significance. The application of archaeological, linguistic, and genetic analysis techniques to Varangian studies has established new standards for historical research, while demonstrating the potential for scientific methods to resolve debates that cannot be settled through traditional textual analysis alone. The cultural continuities that connect modern Eastern European societies to their Varangian origins appear most clearly in legal traditions and administrative practices that preserve institutional approaches to governance and social organization that can be traced to medieval precedents. The emphasis on written legal codes that characterizes modern Eastern European legal systems reflects traditions established during the Kievan period, while concepts of territorial administration and local government preserve elements of political organization that developed through the interaction between Scandinavian and Slavic governmental traditions. Contemporary legal systems throughout the former Varangian territories maintain procedural traditions and institutional structures that reflect medieval precedents established during the period of Varangian political dominance. The emphasis on codified law rather than common law traditions demonstrates continuity with medieval legal innovations that synthesize Scandinavian customary law with Slavic and Byzantine legal principles. Administrative practices that emphasize territorial rather than personal forms of governmental organization similarly reflect institutional choices made during the medieval period that continued to influence political development through subsequent centuries. Architectural influences and urban planning throughout Eastern Europe preserve elements of design principles and construction techniques that originated during the period of Varangian urban development. The fortified city centres that characterize many Eastern European urban areas reflect defensive concerns and architectural solutions that developed during the medieval period, while church architecture throughout the region demonstrates continuity with building traditions that synthesize Scandinavian construction techniques with Byzantine theological requirements and local environmental adaptations. Urban planning principles that emphasize central market areas surrounded by residential districts, organized according to craft specializations, maintain organizational patterns that originated in medieval trading centers established by Varangian merchants. The integration of commercial and residential functions within urban centers reflects planning traditions that developed to serve the needs of international commerce while maintaining defensive capabilities against external threats. These urban design principles have influenced city development throughout Eastern Europe, while providing models for civic organization that transcend their medieval origins. Religious and cultural syncretism that characterizes Orthodox Christianity throughout Eastern Europe demonstrates the lasting influence of cultural synthesis processes that began during the period of Varangian conversion and political integration. The distinctive theological traditions and liturgical practices that distinguish Eastern Orthodox Christianity from both Western Catholic and Byzantine traditions reflect innovations that developed through the encounter between Scandinavian religious concepts and Slavic spiritual traditions within the context of Orthodox theological frameworks. Folk religious practices throughout Eastern Europe preserve elements of pre-Christian traditions that were integrated into Orthodox Christian observance during the medieval period of religious conversion. Seasonal festivals and ceremonial practices that combine Christian religious observance with traditional cultural activities demonstrate continuity with cultural synthesis processes that enabled the preservation of traditional cultural elements within Christian religious frameworks. These syncretic religious practices provide evidence for the flexibility and creativity that characterize medieval religious conversion while maintaining connections to pre-Christian cultural traditions. Literary themes and heroic traditions in Eastern European cultural expression preserve narrative patterns and value systems that originated during the medieval period of Varangian political and cultural development. Epic literature and folk narratives that celebrate military achievement, personal honor, and loyalty to political leaders reflect heroic traditions that synthesized Scandinavian warrior culture with Slavic social values and Christian moral frameworks. These literary traditions have influenced cultural expression throughout Eastern Europe, while providing models for heroic behavior that transcend their medieval origins. The preservation of heroic themes in modern literature, film, and popular culture demonstrates the continuing relevance of medieval cultural values while revealing the ways in which historical memories are adapted to serve contemporary cultural needs. The emphasis on individual achievement within collective enterprises that characterizes much Eastern European heroic literature reflects cultural values that originated during the medieval period while serving modern cultural functions related to national identity and social cohesion. Folk memory and oral traditions throughout Eastern Europe maintain historical consciousness that preserves awareness of medieval political and cultural developments while adapting historical memories to serve contemporary social functions. Place names, family traditions, and community histories often preserve elements of historical knowledge that complement and sometimes contradict official historical narratives, providing evidence for the persistence of historical memory across centuries of political and social change. The survival of historical consciousness in folk traditions demonstrates the extent to which medieval developments created lasting cultural foundations that continued to influence social organization and cultural expression long after the political structures that originally supported them had disappeared. These folk traditions provide historians with alternative sources of historical information while revealing the processes through which historical memory is preserved and transmitted across generations. Modern relevance of Varangian history extends beyond academic interest to provide insights into contemporary processes of cultural exchange, economic globalization, and political integration that resonate with current international developments. The Varangian experience of successful cultural adaptation, while maintaining elements of distinctive identity, provides models for understanding modern migration and integration processes, while their commercial achievements offer historical precedents for understanding the development of international trading networks. Contemporary understanding of early medieval Europe has been enriched by research into Varangian expansion that reveals the complexity and sophistication of cultural exchange during periods that were previously characterized as Dark Ages, dominated by violence and cultural decline. The evidence for extensive commercial relationships, cultural synthesis, and political innovation demonstrated by Varangian achievements challenges simplified narratives of medieval European development while providing evidence for the creativity and adaptability that characterized medieval European societies. Lessons about cultural exchange and integration derived from Varangian history emphasize the importance of flexibility, tolerance, and mutual adaptation in creating successful multicultural societies. The Varangian example demonstrates that successful cultural integration requires both the preservation of valuable cultural elements and the willingness to adapt to local conditions and preferences. This historical experience provides insights that remain relevant for contemporary societies, facing challenges related to immigration, cultural diversity, and international cooperation. Trade networks and globalization parallels between medieval Varangian commercial activities and modern international economic relationships reveal continuities in the processes through which different societies become integrated into broader economic systems. The Varangian success in connecting Northern European economies to international markets provides historical precedents for understanding the benefits and challenges associated with economic globalization, while demonstrating the importance of cultural adaptation and political cooperation in creating successful commercial relationships. Migration and cultural adaptation studies have found in Varangian history valuable case studies for understanding the processes through which immigrant populations integrate into host societies while maintaining elements of their cultural identity. The Varangian experience demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of cultural preservation within contexts of political and social integration, while providing insights into the factors that influence successful adaptation to new cultural environments. The Varangians in popular culture have achieved recognition that extends far beyond academic historical interest to include representation in literature, film, television, and digital media that brings their story to contemporary audiences while adapting their historical experience to serve modern entertainment and cultural needs. Popular representations of Varangian history often emphasize adventure, heroism, and cultural encounter themes that resonate with contemporary audiences, while sometimes distorting historical accuracy to serve narrative and dramatic requirements. The popularity of Varangian themes in contemporary culture demonstrates the continuing appeal of historical narratives that combine individual achievement with broader cultural transformation, while revealing the ways in which historical memories are adapted to serve contemporary cultural functions. These popular representations contribute to historical consciousness, while sometimes creating misconceptions that complicate academic efforts to present accurate historical understanding. The enduring fascination with Varangian history reflects both the inherent drama of their historical experience and the relevance of their achievements for understanding contemporary global processes. Their story provides inspiration for modern audiences, while offering insights into historical processes that remain relevant for understanding cultural change, economic development, and political innovation in the modern world. The warriors who once carried their dreams down the rivers of Eastern Europe continue to influence the dreams of subsequent generations, their legacy preserved not in monuments of stone and steel, but in the genetic inheritance of millions of modern Europeans and the cultural institutions that still shape Eastern European society more than 1,000 years after their longships disappeared forever beneath the waters of the rivers they had once made their highways to empire. By the year 1200, the transformation was complete. The fierce Scandinavian warriors who had once descended the Dnieper rapids with axe and sword had become the founders of nations, the defenders of empires, and the builders of cities that would endure for centuries. In the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, Varangian guards stood watch over Byzantine emperors, their Nordic faces weathered by Mediterranean sun, their axes gleaming in candlelight that flickered across marble walls, carved with runic inscriptions left by homesick warriors. In Kiev and Novgorod, Princes with Scandinavian names ruled Slavic subjects in languages that blended Norse and Slavic roots, while Orthodox crosses adorned the graves of warriors whose grandfathers had worshipped Odin and Thor. The silver coins minted in distant Baghdad filled the burial mounds of Swedish chiefs, carrying the wealth of 3 continents northward, along rivers that had become highways of empire. The Varangians had achieved something their western cousins never managed, not just conquest, but transformation. They had become the bridge between worlds, the thread that connected the amber shores of the Baltic with the marble palaces of Constantinople, the fur traders of the north with the spice merchants of the south. In losing their purely Scandinavian identity, they had gained something greater. They had become the foundation upon which Eastern Europe itself was built. Today, when we trace the genetic heritage of Eastern Europeans, sail the rivers of Russia and Ukraine, or walk through the museums of Scandinavia, we encounter the legacy of the Varangians in countless subtle ways. Their story reminds us that history's greatest achievements often come not from those who conquer and retreat, but from those who arrive as strangers and choose to stay, to adapt, to build something new while honouring what came before. The Varangians transformed themselves in order to transform the world, leaving us a legacy written not just in chronicles and artifacts, but in the very DNA of nations and the enduring connections between peoples, separated by vast distances yet united by shared memories of the dragon ships that once carried northern warriors into the heart of an unknown continent.